Clara Whitmore had stopped crying 3 miles back, not because the pain had lessened, but because she had run out of reasons to believe anyone was coming. She pressed her back against the pine bark and whispered the only prayer she had left. Nobody answered. Nobody ever did. If this story breaks your heart before it heals it, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. Let me see how far this story travels. The horse went down at sunrise. Not dramatically. Not with a stumbling cry or a noble collapse that might have made the moment feel like something worth witnessing. Nah. The animal simply stopped, folded at the knees, and lay down in the dry mountain grass, like it had made a quiet decision that Clara Whitmore had not been consulted about. She stood over it for a long moment. Her boots were already splitting at the left sole. The saddlebag over her shoulder held a change of clothes, $17 she had earned washing laundry for the Hendersons, before they'd made it clear she was no longer welcome near their household. A small folding knife her father had given her when she was 9 years old, and half a biscuit wrapped in a handkerchief. That was everything she owned in the world. She looked out at the mountain range stretching north. The summer sky was pale blue and enormous, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and completely unconsidered by the universe. "All right," Clara said to no one. "All right then." She picked up the saddlebag, adjusted the strap across her shoulder, and started walking. Had left Dunmore, Colorado 2 days ago. Or rather, Dunmore had left her, had pushed her out the way a body expels something it no longer wants to carry. The town had made its feelings known gradually, and then all at once, the way most cruelties work. The whispers, then the turned backs. Then the morning she'd arrived at the schoolhouse to find the door locked and a note in Deputy Creel's handwriting telling her that the school board had voted unanimously to terminate her position, effective immediately, and that she had 3 days to vacate the room she rented from Mrs. Aldridge. Mrs. Aldridge had been considerably less generous with her timeline. "I can't have the scandal attached to my property," the woman had said, not meeting Clara's eyes, pressing her lips, together with the particular expression of someone who considers themselves decent while doing an indecent thing. "You understand, it's nothing personal. It was entirely personal." Every moment of it had been personal, but Clara had not argued. She had packed her things, she had accepted the unfairness the way a woman learns to accept whether something that happens to you, something you survive or you don't, and she had ridden north because north was the only direction that didn't have a face she recognized attached to it. Now the horse was down, and the mountain was up, and Clara Whitmore was 31 years old with $17 and half a biscuit and a very long walk ahead of her. She walked for 2 hours before she heard the stream. She followed the sound downhill through the pines and found the water, and crouched to drink, cupping it in both hands, feeling the cold shock of it against her palms. Her reflection looked back at her from the surface brown hair coming loose from its pins, blue as that looked like they'd recently lost an argument with something much larger than themselves. "You're fine," she told her reflection. Her reflection did not appear convinced. She filled the canteen she'd thought to bring, stood up, and that was when her left knee buckled. She caught herself against a boulder, hissing through her teeth, and stood there for a moment with her eyes shut and her jaw set. A knee had been swelling since yesterday morning. She'd wrapped it with a strip torn from her second dress. It was not a good solution. It was the only solution she had. No. She was still standing there, eyes closed, arguing privately with the pain, when she heard the boots. Not behind her, above her. She had the knife out before she'd consciously decided to reach for it, spinning on her good knee, pressing back against the boulder. A man stood at the top of the creek bank, looking down at her. He was tall, considerably taller than she'd expected, which was an odd thought to have given that she hadn't been expecting anyone at all. Dark hair, long enough to brush his collar. A beard that had been growing without supervision for at least several months. He was lean in the way that hard country makes a man lean, not from want of eating, but from the kind of constant physical work that burns everything unnecessary away. He wore a plain cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, dusty trousers, boots that had seen serious use. No gun visible, though that meant nothing, a hat in his left hand. He was looking at her, with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. Not hostile, not predatory, something more like the look of a man calculating a problem he hadn't anticipated. Inez dropped to the knife in her hand. "That's a skinning knife," he said. His voice was deep, unhurried, the kind of voice that had not been required to hurry in a long time. "It is," Clara said. "You planning to skin me? I'm planning to protect myself." "What? From whatever comes over that ridge uninvited." He looked at her for another moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He sat down at the edge of the creek bank, lowering himself easily to a seated position, elbows on his knees, the hat hanging from his fingers. Making himself smaller, less threatening, as though he understood without being told that a frightened woman needed the space taken out of the equation. "Nathan Cole," he said. She didn't lower the knife. "Clara Whitmore." "Where you headed, Miss Whitmore?" "North. North's a big direction. It's the one I've got." He looked at her knee. "How long you been walking on that?" "Me." She didn't answer immediately. There was something about the directness of the question, the absence of judgment in it, that caught her off guard. Most people, when they looked at a woman in a bad situation, looked with a particular mixture of pity and satisfaction. This man looked at her knee the way you looked at something that needed fixing. "It's yesterday morning," she finally said. He nodded slowly. "Horse go down about 2 miles back." Figured. He stood up and she tightened her grip on the knife. Noticed, and he stopped moving. "My cabin's about 1.5 miles up the eastern slope. I've got food, clean water, something you can wrap that knee with properly. You're welcome to it. No conditions. I don't know you." "No, ma'am, you don't. You could be anyone." "I could," he agreed. "Same way you could be anyone. But you're a woman alone in the mountain with a bad knee, and I'm the only person you've seen for however many days, and that knife is not going to be much use against hypothermia or starvation." He paused. "I'll walk ahead of you the whole way if you want." You keep the knife out. Anything feels wrong, you turn around and go the other direction. Don't stop you." Clara looked at him for a long time. She had spent her entire adult life being given reasons not to trust men who claimed to be offering help. Help always came with something attached, a price, an expectation, a debt to be collected later in a currency she hadn't agreed to. But her knee was swelling, and the mountain had another 8 hours of daylight, and she was not entirely sure she could walk another mile on her own. "You walk ahead," she said. "I keep the knife. Wouldn't expect otherwise. And if you try anything—" "I know what happens," Nathan Cole said, without any trace of humor or resentment. "I won't." He turned and started up the slope without another word. And Clara Whitmore, $17 and half a biscuit and everything broken about life, tucked against chest, followed him. The cabin was not what she'd expected, though she'd have been hard-pressed to explain what she had expected. It sat on a flat shelf of land partway up the eastern face, surrounded by old pines, with a view down into the valley that in other circumstances Clara might have called beautiful. Right now she called it a place to put weight off her knee. Nathan Cole pushed open the door without ceremony and stepped aside. "Go ahead," he said. "I'll see to your horse." "My horse is 2 miles back. I know where it is." "I'll bring it up, see if it's just spent or something worse." He settled his hat on his head. "There's bread on the table, salt pork in the pan on the stove if you want to light it, water in the barrel by the door. Clean cloth for wrapping in the chest at the foot of the bed. Make yourself comfortable, Mr. Cole." "Nathan." She stopped. "Nathan, you don't have to do any of this." He looked at her with an expression she still couldn't quite classify. Not quite patience, not quite resignation, something older than both. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I've been on this mountain for 10 years because I decided a long time ago that people were more trouble than they were worth. I still mostly believe that." He tugged the brim of his hat. But I'm not gonna leave a woman with a bad knee and an empty canteen to figure out the Rockies by herself. That's not trouble, that's just decent. He walked away before she could respond. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment. Then she stepped inside. The bread was hard. The salt pork was adequate. The coffee she managed to produce from the tin near the stove was strong enough to make her eyes water, which she appreciated. Clara sat at the rough-hewn table in Nathan Cole's cabin, and unwrapped her knee, and rewrapped it properly with the clean cloth she'd found exactly where he'd said it would be, and spent some time being very quiet with the reality of her situation. She was in a stranger's cabin on a mountain in Colorado. Her horse was down. She had $17 and no destination. The town she'd spent 4 years building her life in had decided collectively and without much apparent difficulty that she was not worth the trouble of defending. All of that was true. Also true was not dead. She was not in danger, or at least not immediate danger. Each eaten something and wrapped her knee, and the coffee was genuinely excellent. She heard Nathan come back before she saw him boots on the porch, the low voice of a man speaking to an animal with more gentleness than he'd deployed in human conversation. She stood up as he opened the door. "Horse is all right," he said, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Just spent. Couple days of rest, some good water. She'll be sound." He glanced at Clara's knee. "You rewrapped it. You showed me where the cloth was." "I said there was cloth. I didn't show you anything." "You told me where it was." She sat back down. "Thank you. For the horse." He moved to the stove without responding, checked the pan, poured water from the bucket near the door into a tin cup and drank it standing up. "You can sleep in the bed," he said after a moment. "Where will you sleep?" "I've got a bedroll. I'll take the floor." "That's not fair to you, Miss Whitmore." He turned to look at her, and there was something quiet and very certain in his face. "You're injured, you're exhausted, and you've had what it sounds like a considerable run of bad luck." "I'm none of those things. The floor won't hurt me any." "Stop arguing about things that don't need arguing about." Clara looked at him for a moment. "You're a very direct person." "People generally say that like it's a complaint." "I didn't mean it as one." She paused. "In Dunmore, everyone spoke around things. Around each other. Said what they meant to sound polite and meant what they were too cowardly to say plainly." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "Where is Dunmore?" "South and east, small town. Schoolteacher had a reputation she didn't deserve, and nobody with any power saw any reason to defend it." She said it flatly, as a statement of fact rather than an appeal for sympathy. Nathan looked at her, the school board, and the town gossip, and the deputy, who liked having something to enforce, and several other people who knew the truth and decided truth was inconvenient. She folded her hands on the table. "It's a fairly common story, Mr. Cole. I'm not special for having had it happen to me." "Nathan," he said again, "Nathan." She looked up at him. "I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm just explaining why North seemed like the best available option." He considered that for a long moment, in the way she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, not silence for its own sake, not awkwardness, but genuine deliberation. A man who did not speak until he had something worth saying. "And stay," he said finally, "until your knee heals and your horse is ready. After that, wherever you're going is your own business." "I told you. I'm going north. North of here is mostly mountain and then more mountain and eventually Canada," Nathan said. "There's a town called Harker's Ridge, about 12 miles west. It's small, but they've got a school that's been without a teacher for 3 years. Widow Calloway runs the general store, and she's a fair woman. If you needed a place to land, that wasn't just a direction." Lara stared at him. "You're telling me where to go." "Yeah. I'm telling you what's there," he said, with the careful precision of a man who understood the difference. "What you do with it is your own decision." She studied him for a moment. In Dunmore, men who offered information wanted something for it. Information was currency, and currency always came due. But Nathan Cole was already turning back to the stove, apparently finished with the conversation, entirely without expectation. "Why are you on this mountain?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Same reason people usually are. Which is, running from something." He didn't look at her. "Or hiding. Depends on the day. What are you hiding from?" Another long pause. "That's a conversation for later," he said. "Right now you need to rest that knee." And that clearly was all she was going to get. She slept 12 hours. She woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, a regular rhythm that was oddly reassuring, the sound of someone doing the ordinary work of living, without urgency or violence. She lay still for a moment, listening, orienting herself. Then she sat up and found that her knee hurt considerably less, and that Nathan Cole had left coffee on the stove and a plate of something she couldn't immediately identify, but which smelled like salvation. She ate standing at the window, watching him work. It was the kind of economy she had never seen in a man before, not slow, not fast, but exact. Each swing of the axe landing where it was meant to land. No wasted motion, no performance, just the work being done. Nay, she was still watching when he looked up and saw her in the window. He did not wave, he did not smile, he just looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the wood and kept working. Clara finished her breakfast. By mid-morning she'd swept the cabin floor, reorganized the supply shelf in a way that made considerably more practical sense than its previous arrangement, and identified 3 items in need of repair that she was fairly certain she could address herself. Knee was holding. She was not a woman who was comfortable with stillness. Nathan came in at noon, found her mending a tear in a leather strap that had clearly been left in that condition for several months, and stopped in the doorway. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know I don't have to." She pulled the thread through. "You have a better needle. This one's too large." He looked at her. Then he went to the chest near the wall, rummaged for a moment, and produced a smaller sewing needle. Held it out, "Thank you." She switched needles, examined her work, continued. "You have a fence post on the south side that's rotted through at the base. The second rail is going to go with it if you don't replace it before the next hard rain." Nathan sat down across the table from her. "I know about the fence post. And I've been meaning to get to it. When?" "When I got to it." Clara looked up at him. "How long have you been meaning to get to it?" Pause. "Since April. It's July, Nathan." Something moved in his face that might, in a less controlled man, have become a smile. "I'm aware of the month. I can help you replace it." "Your knee." "My knee is better. I can dig a post hole. I used to dig fence posts with my father when I was 12 years old. I am not made of glass." He looked at her for a long moment. She met his gaze without flinching. People in Dunmore had mistaken her composure for fragility, her quietness for weakness. It had been their consistent and fundamental error about her character. "After lunch," Nathan said. "After lunch," Clara agreed. They replaced the fence post in the afternoon, working with the kind of side-by-side silence that was not uncomfortable because it was not required to be anything other than what it was. Nathan dug. Clara measured. Nathan set the post. Clara tamped it level, eyeballing it with the particular precision of someone who had learned the skill young and not forgotten it. "Your father was a farmer?" Nathan asked at some point in the middle of the work. "Rancher. Small operation." She tamped another. "Died when I was 17. My mother the year after." "I'm sorry. It was a long time ago." She straightened. "After that I took whatever work I could find. Laundry, mending, cooking. Eventually I got a teaching certificate. Taught in 3 different towns before Dunmore." "And they all ended badly?" "2 of them ended fine. Me. One of them ended because the school board decided to hire someone local. Dunmore ended because," she paused. "Because a powerful man decided I'd rejected him, and he was the sort of man who made other people pay for his wounded pride." The silence after that was different from the one before. Nathan set the next rail without speaking for a moment. Finally asked, "Gerald Marsh owns most of the land west of town." Town council, church deacon, very good at looking like a respectable man. And Deputy Creel? Works for Marsh in the ways that matter. Doesn't know it or doesn't care. Hard to tell which. Nathan drove the rail home, with 3 clean strikes of the mallet. You just left. I didn't just leave. Something sharp moved through her voice. I stayed 6 months after it started. I tried to fight it through proper channels. I went to the school board. I went to the circuit judge when he passed through. I told the truth to anyone who would listen. She looked at him steadily. The problem with truth in a town where one man controls most of the money is that truth becomes whatever that man decides it is. Nathan was Clara said. Eventually I left. Meet, because going to destroy me, and I wasn't willing to let Gerald Marsh destroy me. That's not weakness, Nathan said. I know that. She held his gaze. I never said it was. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he picked up the next rail. They finished the fence as the sun started pulling westward. Clara straightened up, pressed her hands to the small of her back, and looked at the work. It'll hold, she said. It will, Nathan agreed. She turned to look at him. He was studying the fence line with that characteristic thoughtful expression, hat brim low against the western light. Nathan, she said, what are you hiding from? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. And had a wife, he said, 10 years ago, and a daughter. Old. Clara went very still. Fever came through the valley. Took most of a small settlement in about 3 weeks. His voice was flat, the flatness of something said many times privately until it had been worn smooth. I buried them both in October. Nathan, after that I came up here. He turned away from the fence, starting back toward the cabin. There's nothing up here that matters enough to lose. Clara stood where she was for a moment. The evening was coming on, the light going gold and long across the mountain grass. She thought about Gerald Marsh and his wounded pride. She thought about Mrs. Aldridge's carefully averted eyes. She thought about the $16 schoolroom she'd built over 4 years, the children who had actually learned things in it, the small life she'd constructed out of determination and refusal to give up. All of it dismantled in 3 weeks by one man's spite. She thought about a man who had gone up a mountain 10 years ago because the pain of the valley was too great to stay in. She did not call after him. She walked back to the cabin at her own pace, in her own time, with her knee holding steady and her jaw set the way it had been set since Dunmore and the $17 and the horse that had finally given out. She was not going to fix Nathan Cole. She was not going to be saved by him either. But she was here, and the fence post was set, and the coffee in the morning had been very good. That was enough for today. 3 days passed. Then 4, then a week, the knee healed. The horse recovered, grazing on the mountain grass with the uncomplicated satisfaction of an animal unbothered by human complication. Clara fixed the 2 other things she'd identified in need of repair on the first day, and found several more, and fixed those too. Not because she felt obligated, because idleness did not suit her, and the work was there to be done. Nathan watched her without appearing to watch her. She had spent enough years around men who pretended not to pay attention to know exactly what it looked like. But his attention was different from the kind she'd learned to be wary of. He was not cataloging her. He was not calculating. She gradually came to understand, simply trying to figure out what she was. She could have told him that most people never managed it. You're still here, he said, on the 8th morning. It was not an accusation. It was more like a fact he was examining for accuracy. My horse is sound enough to travel, Clara said, at the stove, not turning around. I know. Harker's Ridge is a good town, Widow Calloway. I heard you the first time. She turned around. I'm not ready to go yet. He looked at her. I've spent the last 6 months, she said carefully, being pushed out of a place I built for myself. Being told to leave. Being made to feel like my being somewhere was a problem to be solved. She set down the coffee pot. I will leave when I am ready to leave, Nathan, and I am not ready yet. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. That was all he said. And that, Clara Whitmore thought, was the first time in a very long time that a man had responded to her stating her own mind without trying to rearrange it into something more convenient. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one on his side of the table. Nah, he sat down. Nah. They drank their coffee in the morning quiet of the mountain. And somewhere below them, in a small Colorado town that had made its choice, Gerald Marsh was making plans of his own. Nah. But that was below. Up here, there was coffee, and a repaired fence, and 2 people who had each spent too long alone, beginning very slowly, and with great caution, and without any particular expectation, to consider that perhaps the mountain was large enough for more than one person's silence. Clara looked out the window at the pines. Nathan looked at his coffee. Neither of them said anything. It was enough. The second week began with an argument about eggs. Not about anything important. Not about the fence or the supplies or the sleeping arrangements or the 10,000 unspoken things that had been accumulating in the cabin like dry wood, waiting for a spark. About eggs. Nathan came in from the morning chores and found Clara at the stove, and found that she had reorganized the way the eggs were stored. And he stood in the doorway, looking at the new arrangement with the particular expression of a man who has not had his habits questioned in a very long time. "I moved them," Clara said, without turning around. "I can see that. They were in a bad spot, too close to the heat from the stove. You were losing them faster than you needed to. I know where my eggs were. And now you know where they are." She turned around and looked at him with the clear, direct gaze he was beginning to recognize as her default mode of operation. "New spot is better. I'm not asking for your approval." Nathan looked at the eggs. He looked at Clara. He put his hat on the peg by the door and sat down at the table without another word. Clara poured his coffee and set it in front of him. He drank it. That was how most of their disagreements went, which was to say they were disagreements that never quite managed to become fights, because one of them, usually Nathan. Occasionally, Clara recognized in time that the thing being argued about was not the actual thing. The actual thing was harder to put words to. It was the fact that Clara Whitmore had been in his cabin for 12 days, and the cabin felt different. Not worse, just different. There were dried herbs hanging near the window that she'd gathered from somewhere on the slope. The supply shelf made sense now in a way it previously had not. The table had been scrubbed. The smell of coffee in the mornings was different, richer, because she'd figured out that he'd been measuring wrong for years, and had corrected it without announcing correction. Nathan had lived alone for 10 years. He had built his solitude the way you build a good fence, deliberately, post by post, with attention to the places most likely to fail. And Clara Whitmore had walked through his gate on a bad knee with a skinning knife and $17, and she had not asked his permission to matter. That was the actual problem. He was not ready to say it out loud. He suspected she already knew. "The Harker's Ridge supply rider comes through the valley on Thursdays," he said, the morning of the 12th day, not looking up from his coffee. "That's tomorrow. If you wanted to send word ahead to Widow Calloway." About the teaching position. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is that your way of telling me to leave?" "No." He said it without hesitation, which surprised him slightly. "It's my way of telling you that the option exists." In case you'd forgotten, she sat down across from him. He made himself look at her, because avoiding her eyes had started to feel like the kind of cowardice he didn't think much of in himself. "I haven't forgotten," she said. "I'm thinking about it." "What's there to think about? Whether I'm running towards something or just running." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've done enough running. I'd like the next place I go to be a choice, not an escape." Nathan was quiet. She asked. "No," he said. "That's the smartest thing I've heard anyone say in 10 years. He paused. "Which is not saying a great deal, given that I've been talking primarily to horses." Clara looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Then something shifted in her face, and she laughed, a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and the sound of it in the cabin was so unexpected that Nathan felt it somewhere in his chest, like a physical impact. He looked back at his coffee. "Thursday," he said. No pressure, just letting you know. She didn't send word on Thursday. She also didn't leave. What she did instead was ask Nathan to show her how to check the traps he ran on the North Slope, which led to the first time they spent an extended period of time together outside the cabin, moving through the mountain in the particular intimacy of people doing practical work side by side. He showed her the trap lines without commentary, explained the logic of their placement, answered her questions with the economy she'd come to expect from him. She paid attention the way she paid attention to everything completely, without vanity, storing what she learned. You do this every day, she asked. Every other day in summer. Alone, generally, she was quiet for a moment, moving alongside him through the trees. Doesn't it get... She stopped herself. Lonely? He said it without discomfort, which meant he'd made peace with the word somewhere along the way. I was going to say monotonous. Sometimes. He checked a trap, reset it, straightened. Lonely is different. Lonely is when you want company and don't have it. I didn't want company, past tense. He glanced at her. What? Didn't, Clara said. Past tense, you said you didn't want company. Nathan said nothing for a moment. Then he started walking again. Next trap is about a quarter-mile north, he said. Mere. Clara followed, and said nothing more about it, and the thing she'd noticed hung between them in the clear summer air, like something that had been spoken into permanence. It was on the 14th day that the first real crack appeared. Not between Clara and Nathan. Between the piece of the mountain and the world below it. Ryder came from the south, following the eastern trail, and Nathan saw him from the ridge before he reached the cabin. Came down off the high ground quickly and got to the yard in time to meet the man before he reached the door. He was young 19, maybe 20, with the look of someone who'd been riding hard and hadn't enjoyed the experience. Got a message. He handed over a folded paper. From a man named Creel, in Dunmore, said you'd know what it was about if you had a woman named Whitmore on your property. Nathan took the paper. He did not open it immediately. Creel send you personally? No, sir. Handed it to the supply rider at Dunmore and paid him to pass it along. Supply rider gave it to me at the way station. How much did Creel pay? The young man told him. That's a lot of money for a message, Nathan said. Yes, sir. Nathan looked at the paper in his hand. Then he gave the rider $3 from his own pocket for the trouble and told him there was water at the trough and corn for his horse. He ate until the rider left the yard, before he opened the letter. The handwriting was aggressive, the penmanship of a man who considered himself educated and wanted you to know it. Mr. Cole, it has come to our attention that you may be harboring a woman by the name of Clara Whitmore, late of Dunn, in Colorado, who departed this jurisdiction under circumstances that are presently under legal review. Miss Whitmore is required to return to Dunmore to address certain matters relating to property and financial obligation before she may freely remove herself from the county. Any individual found to be obstructing her return may be subject to legal consequence. This notice is issued on behalf of Mr. Gerald Marsh, landowner, by his agent Deputy H. Real. Nathan read it twice. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases, put it in his shirt pocket and went inside. Clara was at the table, doing something with the ledger he used for supply tracking. She'd found several accounting errors he hadn't bothered to correct, and had apparently decided to correct them herself. She looked up when he came in, and something in his face made her set down the pen. Is it? He put the letter on the table. She read it. He watched her face. She read it with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who has learned to extract exactly what a document is saying and exactly what it is not saying, and when she finished, she set it down with a steadiness that cost her something. 80, she said. And financial obligation. What does that mean? It means Gerald Marsh found a way to make my leaving look like theft. Her voice was even. Too even. I rented a room from Mrs. Aldridge, paid in full, through the end of the month I left. But Marsh owns the building Mrs. Aldridge rents from. If he decided to claim I owed unpaid rent or damaged property, or she stopped, doesn't matter what he claimed. All that matters is that he claimed it, and Creel signed the paper. Enforce this not easily. Not legally. But that's not the point. She looked up at him. The point is that Gerald Marsh is telling you that helping me has a cost. Warning you off. Her jaw was set, and I'm sorry. I didn't know he'd follow me this far. Don't apologize for what that man does, Nathan said. Nathan, don't. The word came out with more weight than he intended. He sat down across from her and looked at the letter. Is there anything in this that can actually touch you? Legally? A territorial judge who knows Marsh's name might make something of the property claim. B. Might hold me on it while it was sorted out. Long enough for she didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Long enough for Marsh to get to her. Yeah. Long enough to make the last few weeks of peace dissolve back into the thing she'd been running from. And you're not going to Harker's Ridge yet, Nathan said. She looked at him. Not until we know what they're actually planning. He leaned forward, arms on the table. You said Creel works for Marsh, the ways that matter. How far does that go? Far enough that I don't think a badge would stop him from doing whatever Marsh told him to do. And Marsh himself? He's not a man who does his own dirty work. He pays for it and keeps his hands clean and his name in the church ledger. The bitterness in her voice was old and compressed, like something that had been living under pressure for a long time. He is very good at being respectable. Nathan was quiet for a moment. I know men like that, he said. Most women do. She looked at her hands on the table. I should leave. I should go further north than Harker's Ridge. Go somewhere Marsh's name doesn't mean anything. Start over again. She looked up. That's probably what I should do. Is that what you want to do? No. The word came out without hesitation. I'm tired of starting over. I'm tired of men like Gerald Marsh deciding where I'm allowed to be. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Then stay, he said. Simply plainly with the directness that was his most consistent characteristic. And stay until we figure out what he's actually capable of. Don't owe me that. No, he agreed. I don't. He said nothing else. He didn't need to. Days passed, quiet days, or days that looked quiet from the outside. Under the surface of them, something had changed. Nathan found himself paying attention differently. Not to the mountain he knew by reflex, by 10 years of daily familiarity, but to Clara. To the way she moved through his space, with a kind of determined ownership that had nothing to do with claiming anything from him, with the fact that she was a woman who had been told too many times that she didn't belong somewhere, and had developed a bone-deep refusal to perform smallness. Nay, she was teaching herself to read the traps. He found her at the north line on the second morning, crouched over the third set, working out from first principles why he'd placed it where he had. The deer trail comes down from the ridge here, Aiden, she said, when she heard his boots, not looking up. But there's a rock formation that deflects the path about 30 feet east before it reaches the stream. So you set the trap on the deflection, not the trail itself. Nathan stopped beside her. That's right. How long did it take you to figure that out? About 3 months of empty sets. She stood up, dusting her hands on her skirt. B, what else did you figure out in 3 months of empty sets? He thought about the question more seriously than she might have expected. That patience is not the same as passivity. You can be waiting very actively. Clara looked at him with that expression he'd seen several times now, the one that meant she was reassessing something about him. He'd noticed that she did it without embarrassment, without trying to hide the reassessment. Most people, when they realized they'd underestimated someone, tried to cover it. Clara just looked at you, with new information visible on her face, and adjusted accordingly. He found it remarkably easy to be around. I need to tell you something, she said. All right, about Dunmore, about what actually happened. She looked at the trap rather than at him. I told you the shape of it. Marsh, his wounded pride, Creel, the school board, itch. But I didn't tell you all of it. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. She looked up. I want to. Because you've put yourself in Marsh's line of sight by keeping me here, and you deserve to know exactly what that means. Waited. Gerald Marsh asked me to marry him, she said. Months ago. He did it in front of witnesses, which was strategic, because it meant my refusal was public. I said no politely, and then more plainly when polite wasn't sufficient, and he smiled at me and said he understood completely and that he bore no ill will. She paused. 3 weeks later, a woman in town began telling people that she'd seen me behaving inappropriately with the husband of one of my students. It was a lie. A complete, specific, detailed lie, with enough invented particulars to make it sound credible. And Marsh stood in front of the church the following Sunday and said very quietly and with great sadness that he hoped people would be charitable in their judgment of those who struggled with moral weakness. Nathan said nothing. That's what he did, Clara said. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He destroyed my reputation with a sympathetic voice and a church congregation. And when the school board voted me out, he sent flowers to the schoolhouse the following week, with a note saying he hoped the children would not be too disrupted by the transition. She looked at Nathan directly. That is the man whose letter you have in your pocket. A long moment of silence on the mountain. He's not going to stop, Nathan said. No, coming after you legally is just the opening move. Next move. Clara folded her arms. He'll send someone. Not Creel is useful for papers and intimidation. He'll send someone harder, someone who gets paid to solve problems quietly. The words settled between them with the weight of something specific and serious. Nathan took the letter out of his pocket. He looked at it for a moment, then folded it again. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, we know what's coming. He put the letter back in his pocket. Knowing is better than not knowing. Now we plan. Clara looked at him. Unless you'd rather handle Gerald Marsh on your own. I've been handling Gerald Marsh on my own for 7 months, she said. I'm standing on a mountain in Colorado with $17 and a recovering horse. So perhaps some company on the problem would not be the worst thing. This time it was Nathan who almost smiled. Come on, he said. I'll show you the South Trap Line. Different terrain, different logic. You'll want to understand both. They spent the afternoon working the South Line, and Nathan talked more than he had talked in possibly years. Not because he was suddenly a different man, but because Clara asked the right questions practical questions that required specific, practical answers, and the conversation that emerged from them was the kind that substance and direction and did not exhaust him. She told him about the school she'd built in Dunmore. Not sentimentally, not with self-pity, but with the specificity of someone describing work they had genuinely loved. The children who had come in unable to read and left with the particular light in their eyes that a person gets when they realize that their own mind is more capable than they'd been told. A girl in the second row, who had been written off with 2 previous teachers, and had turned out to have the sharpest mathematical mind Clara had ever encountered in a child that age. Nathan asked, May Teller, 11 years old. Her father worked at the mill. Clara was quiet for a moment. She came to say goodbye when I left. She stood at the edge of town with her lunch pail, and she said, very formally, that she intended to learn mathematics until she understood everything there was to understand about it, and that she was sorry the town had treated me poorly. Beat. 11 years old. What happened to her? She'll be fine, Clara said with a certainty that was clearly hard-won. She's too stubborn not to be. And too smart, she looked at the trap line ahead. I just hope whoever teaches her next doesn't waste what she's built. Nathan looked at her profile against the mountain sky. Love that job. I love teaching, full stop. Not that job, specifically the job was in a town that turned out to be poisonous. The work, she nodded slowly. Yes, I love the work. Then Harker's Ridge makes sense. I know it does. She glanced at him. When it's safe to go. I'll make sure it's safe to go. She stopped walking. He stopped 2 paces ahead and turned back. Why? She asked. Not accusingly, genuinely. You said yourself you came up here because people were more trouble than they were worth. And here I am. A considerable amount of trouble, as it turns out. Nathan looked at her for a long moment. Yeah, he said. He turned and kept walking. After a beat, Clara followed. She did not push for more than that, because she was learning to read him the way he read the mountain, by understanding that the surface was not always where the meaning lived. Earth Week brought heat and a decision. The heat came first, the particular dry mountain heat of a Colorado July that settled over the high country like something with weight. Nathan worked with his sleeves rolled and his hat pulled low. Clara worked with her hair pinned up and her jaw set in that expression he'd catalogued as her default under difficulty. The decision came at midweek in the evening when Nathan came in from checking the water situation at the Eastern Spring and found Clara sitting at the table with his map spread out and a piece of paper covered in her handwriting. He stood in the doorway. "You're mapping Marsh's likely approach routes," he said. "And the legal structure." She didn't look up. "The property claim he's using is thin. If we could get it in front of an honest judge, not someone in his pocket it wouldn't hold. The problem is getting it there, before he can apply enough pressure to make it go away." She looked up. "Do you know anyone, a lawyer, a judge, a federal man, anyone outside the territory who Marsh's money can't reach?" Nathan was quiet. Then he crossed to the table and looked at the map. "There's a federal land office in Denver," he said slowly. "Man named Patterson runs it. I knew him a long time ago before the mountain." He paused. "He's honest. The kind of honest that's inconvenient for men like Marsh." Clara sat up straighter. "How do you know him?" "We worked together." "Before." The word "before" carried the weight of the whole decade behind it. "He'd know my name. Would he help?" "He'd listen." Nathan straightened. "Whether he can help depends on what Marsh has actually put on paper." "Then we need to know exactly what Marsh has put on paper." Clara looked at the letter again. "We need someone in Dunmore." A pause. "I know someone," Nathan said. Slowly, as though pulling the words up from somewhere he hadn't visited in a long time. "A woman named Ruth Adler. She ran the dry goods store when I before the mountain. She's sharp and she's stubborn, and she never liked men who use their money as a substitute for character." "Trust her? As much as I trust anyone." Clara looked at him. "That's not a ringing endorsement. It's the most honest answer I can give you." He met her eyes. "I haven't trusted many people in 10 years. She's on the list." Something shifted between them in that moment, something careful and significant, the way a door shifts when someone puts their hand on it without quite turning the handle. "Then we write to Ruth Adler," Clara said. "And we write to Patterson in Denver. And we find out what Gerald Marsh has actually built, before it gets here." "Agreed. And if it gets here before we're ready." Nathan's expression did not change. "Then we deal with it when it gets here." "You make that sound simple." "It is simple. Complicated and simple at the same time." He sat down across from her. "Marsh is powerful in Dunmore because Dunmore lets him be powerful. He's considerably less powerful on a mountain in Colorado, where the only law is about 30 miles away, and I know every inch of the terrain." Clara looked at him steadily. "I don't want you to fight my battles." "I know you don't. I mean it. I didn't come up here to trade one man's control for another." "I know that too." He leaned forward. "Clara, I'm not trying to fight your battles. I'm trying to fight beside you. There's a difference." The silence that followed was different from their usual silences. It was the silence of something having been said that could not be unsaid, not because it was regrettable, but because it had shifted the air in the room in a way that both of them could feel, and neither of them was quite ready to name. Looked down at the map. "All right," she said. "All right. Then let's write those letters." They spent the next 2 hours at the table together, composing 2 letters with the kind of careful precision that the situation required. Nathan dictated the letter to Patterson, dry, factual, careful, and Clara wrote it in her schoolteacher's hand. Clara wrote the letter to Ruth Adler herself, and when she was done, she passed it to Nathan, and he read it through and looked up at her. "You know how to make a case," he said. "I was a teacher." "Making a case is half the job." She took the letter back. I had 17 students one year who were convinced that arithmetic was invented specifically to torment them. You had to make the case that it was worth their time. Compared to that, convincing a dry goods store owner that Gerald Marsh is corrupt is straightforward. Nathan looked at her. How do you do that? Do what? Make hard things sound like they have solutions. Clara was quiet for a moment. Because they usually do, she said. Hard things and impossible things look alike from the inside. The only way to know which one you're dealing with is to keep working on it until you find out. Nathan was quiet for a long moment after that, looking at the letter in her hands. Looking at the map. Looking, she realized, at her. The supply rider comes again on Thursday, he said. I know. The letters can go out then, I know that too. He nodded, near. Then he stood up and went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee that neither of them technically needed and set one in front of her. You hungry? He said. Somewhat. I'll make something. And that was that. Most the consequential conversation they had yet had, ending in coffee, and the practical question of dinner, the way real conversations between real people do not with dramatic declarations but with the small, continuous acts of being present in each other's lives. Clara gathered the letters and set them carefully on the shelf above the table. Nathan cooked. Outside, the summer dark was coming on over the mountain, and somewhere south of them, in a town built on one man's ability to make people afraid, Gerald Marsh was sitting in his large house making plans. He didn't know about Ruth Adler. He didn't know about a federal man named Patterson in Denver. He didn't know about the woman at Nathan Cole's table, who had spent years learning to make a case out of impossible things. And he didn't know because he had never once in his life bothered to understand a man he couldn't buy what Nathan Cole was actually capable of when he had decided that something was worth protecting. The mountain was quiet, the letters were written, and Clara Whitmore, for the first time in 7 months, went to sleep that night without checking the door. Ruth Adler's reply came on a Tuesday, 11 days after the letters went out. Aidan heard the horse before he saw the rider, which was how it always was on the mountain sound, traveled faster than sight up here, and he'd learned to pay attention to the quality of hoofbeats, the way other men paid attention to weather. The horse was moving fast, too fast for casual delivery. He was already standing in the yard when the rider crested the trail. It was the same young man as before, but this time he didn't look like someone who'd had an uncomfortable ride. He looked like someone who'd been frightened into speed. He handed the letter down without dismounting. Man in Dunmore paid me double to get that here fast as I could, he said. And it was urgent. Said the woman who wrote it said to tell you her words, that the wolf has already left the pen. Nathan took the letter. When did you leave Dunmore? Yesterday morning, before sunup. Anyone follow you out? The rider hesitated just long enough. I don't think so. He took the north road out, not the main trail. Good. Nathan gave him money, told him to water the horse and go, and did not wait until the rider was out of the yard before he went inside. Clara was at the stove. She read his face before he said a word and set down what she was holding. He put the letter on the table, and they read it together. Ruth Adler's handwriting was nothing like the aggressive penmanship of Creel's letter. It was small and precise and moved fast across the page, the handwriting of a woman with too much to say and not enough paper to say it on. Nathan, Lord, it's been years. I wish this letter were a social call. It isn't. Marsh filed a legal complaint 2 weeks ago with the territorial court claiming Clara Whitmore made off with $60 in rent arrears and a piece of property, a teaching ledger he claims belongs to the school, which he now says he owns by deed, since the board voted to transfer the schoolhouse title to his land company last month. A judge named Foley signed the warrant. Foley drinks at Marsh's table every Friday. Clara needs to know this warrant is real, even if the claim isn't. More importantly, Marsh sent 2 men north 4 days ago. I don't know their names. I know one of them was in town for 3 days before they left, and he was asking questions about Coles Mountain and the trails up from the valley. Not lawmen. Be careful. I've written to Patterson in Denver myself. He'll move if he can, but move faster than you think you need to. Ruth. Clara finished reading. She did not reach for the tape. She did not show anything on her face that she wasn't prepared to show. Her hands, Nathan noticed, had gone very still. Days ago, she said. Which means they could be in the valley by now. Or on the trail, or already watching the approach. He folded the letter. You're not surprised that he'd send men? She shook her head. I told you. He pays for his dirty work. I'm surprised it took this long. She looked at Nathan. How many ways up to the cabin? 3 main trails. Half a dozen approaches a man on foot could manage if he knew the terrain. And if he doesn't know the terrain, then the 3 main trails. Nathan was already moving, pulling his coat from the peg, checking the rifle he kept by the door with the efficient motions of a man running through a familiar mental process. They'll come in daylight the first time, not to act, to look, to find out what they're dealing with, and then they'll decide. He loaded the rifle without hurry. Men like the ones Marsh hires, they're not soldiers. Persuaders. Their first move will be to try to talk you out of here. And if talking doesn't work, he looked at her over the rifle. We find out what their second move is. Clara looked at the rifle. Then she looked at him. I can shoot. Can you? My father raised me on a ranch east of Pueblo, she said. Yes, Nathan, I can shoot. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he went to the chest at the far wall and came back with a revolver, checked its cylinder and set it on the table in front of her. You know how to check if it's loaded, he said. It was not a question. She picked it up, checked it, set it back down. Yes. Nodded. All right, here's what we do. First morning passed without incident. Then the second. Nathan moved through his routine with the surface appearance of normalcy and the internal state of a man listening to everything beneath the normal sounds. Clara did not ask him what he was hearing. She understood, from years of being the person in the room that Pum underestimated, how to wait without showing that she was waiting. On the third morning, Nathan came back from the north trapline early. He came in and poured water from the bucket and drank it, and then, he said, ate calmly. There are 2 men on the eastern ridge. Clara set down the pen she'd been using. How far? Quarter mile. They've got a sight line to the cabin. How long have they been there? Since before I went out, probably. They were already positioned when I came up the north line. He set the cup down. They're not trying to hide. They want me to know they're there. That's the opening move, Clara said. The message before the message. So they'll come down today or tomorrow. He looked at her steadily. They do? Let me do the talking first. Nathan? Not because you can't talk, he said, with the precision of a man who understood exactly what she was thinking. Because they've come here assuming they're dealing with a woman alone who's been given shelter by a man who doesn't know what he's gotten into. If I'm the one who answers the door, they spend the first 5 minutes recalculating. That's 5 minutes we use. Clara considered this. It was tactically sound. She didn't like it, which was separate from whether it was sound. Fine, she said. You talk first, but I'm in the room. Wouldn't have it any other way. She looked at him. There was something in his voice when he said it level, and certain, not performative, just plain that settled something in her chest she hadn't known was unsettled. All right, she said. We wait. They came down at noon the next day, 2 men as Ruth's letter had said. The first one was built wide and moved carefully, the kind of careful that meant he'd been in situations that punished carelessness before. He wore a good coat for summer, which meant he was concealing something under it. The second man was thinner, younger, with the look of someone who'd been hired for speed rather than weight. Nathan was standing in the yard when they came through the gate. He had his arms at his sides and his hat on, and the rifle was inside. He looked like a man who had simply stepped out to see who was calling, which was exactly what he was. One said, That's right. My name's Briggs. I represent Mr. Gerald Marsh of Dunmore, Colorado. We're here regarding a woman named Clara Whitmore. I know why you're here, Nathan said. Briggs stopped about 10 feet out. The thin one stayed 2 steps behind and to the right, and Nathan noted the position the way he noted everything without appearing to. Then you know the situation, Briggs said. Miss Whitmore is wanted on a legal warrant issued by the territorial court. She needs to come back to Dunmore to address the charges. What charges specifically? A small pause. Briggs hadn't expected to be asked for specifics. Property theft and unpaid debt. $60 in rent arrears and a ledger book, Nathan said. Read the warrant. Another pause longer, Briggs reassessing. And then you know it's legitimate. I know it's been signed by a judge who eats at Marsh's table every Friday, Nathan said, still in the same level tone. That's not quite the same thing. The thin man shifted his weight. Briggs kept his face neutral. Mr. Cole, we're not here to cause any trouble. Mr. Marsh simply wants this matter resolved through proper legal channels. If Miss Whitmore comes back willingly, I'm sure the charges can be. The door behind Nathan opened. Clara stepped out onto the porch. She had the revolver on her hip, not in her hand, just visible, and she'd put her hair up with the kind of deliberate neatness that communicated she had chosen to look this way, that it was a choice made with intention. She stood beside Nathan, she'd worn when she'd told the Dunmore School Board, very calmly and very clearly, what Gerald Marsh was. Briggs looked at her, then at Nathan, then at the revolver. Miss Whitmore, he said, Mr. Marsh would like. I know what Mr. H would like, Clara said. He would like me afraid enough to come back to a town. He's arranged for a warrant and a compliant judge, and whatever story he's told the congregation this week about my character. Her voice was entirely steady. He is going to be disappointed. Briggs shifted his approach. Ma'am, the warrant is a legal document. The warrant is a piece of paper signed by a man who owes Gerald Marsh money, Clara said. Yeah. I have a letter from a federal land officer in Denver who is currently reviewing both the warrant and the property transfer that Marsh used to manufacture the underlying claim. When that review is complete, we will see which piece of paper matters more. That landed. She watched it land on Briggs' face, the slight recalibration of a man who had been sent to collect a frightened woman and had found something considerably more complicated. You've contacted the federal office, Briggs said. 2 weeks ago. She looked at him with the clear, particular attention of a woman who has learned that looking directly at a man who expects to be accommodated was itself a form of resistance. Mr. Briggs, I understand you're being paid to bring me back to Dunmore. I understand that's your job today, but I want you to understand something in return. I'm not going back, and the man who sent you has started a legal process that he does not currently understand the full consequences of. If you go back to Dunmore and tell him that, you'll have done him a genuine service. A long silence on the mountain. The thin man was looking at the revolver. Briggs was looking at Clara. Nathan had not moved or spoken. He didn't need to. He stood beside Clara the way the mountain stood behind the cabin's solid present, not making a show of itself but entirely unmistakable. We'll be in contact, Briggs said finally. I assumed you would be, Clara said. 2 men walked back through the gate. Nathan and Clara watched them go in silence. When the sound of their horses had faded down the trail, Clara let out a breath that she'd been holding for approximately 3 minutes. Federal Review, Nathan said, without turning. Patterson's letter confirmed he was looking at it. I just didn't mention that looking wasn't the same as ruling. Bought us time. Some, she said, not much. Briggs is going to go back to Marsh and tell him about the federal contact, and Marsh is going to decide whether to back down or escalate. She turned to look at Nathan. He's not going to back down, no, Nathan agreed. He's not. The letter from Patterson arrived the following week, and it was not the letter either of them had hoped for. It was careful and precise and apologetic in the way that bureaucratic letters were apologetic, full of language that meant something was wrong without quite committing to saying what it was. Patterson confirmed the review. He confirmed the warrant was under scrutiny. He also confirmed in a paragraph near the end that Clara had to read 3 times before she was sure she understood it, that Judge Foley had filed a counter-complaint with the territorial governor's office claiming federal overreach, and that the governor's office was reviewing whether Patterson had jurisdiction. Marsh got to the governor, Nathan said. Or someone who knows the governor. Clara set the letter down. She was angry. A clean, cold anger that she'd learned years ago was more useful than the hot kind. This is what he does. He doesn't fight, he redirects. Every time you build a wall, he builds a door around it. How long will the jurisdictional review take? Weeks. Maybe months. She looked at Nathan. We don't have months. Briggs came back to Dunmore, told Marsh about the federal contact, and Marsh responded by tying Patterson's hands. Which means the next thing that comes up that mountain won't be men trying to talk me into leaving. Nathan looked at the letter. Then he looked at Clara. Something moved in his face that was not fear and not anger, but something older than both, the expression of a man who has calculated a thing and does not love the answer. Ruth, he said. What about her? Her letter said she wrote to Patterson herself. Means Marsh knows there's someone in Dunmore talking. He stood up from the table. If Marsh is willing to go to the governor's office, he's willing to make Ruth Adler's life very difficult. Clara went still. She knew the risk when she wrote. Knowing the risk and living with the consequences are different things. He moved to the window. Need to send her word. Make sure she's all right. Nathan. Her voice stopped him. You're worried about her. She's been in that town for 30 years. She built something there. I don't want Marsh destroying it, because she helped me. Helped us, Clara said quietly. He turned. She helped us. Don't carry that alone. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded, once. I'll write the letter today, he said. We'll write it, she corrected, and moved to the table without waiting for his agreement. 3 days later, Briggs came back. He came alone this time, which was more alarming than when he'd come with company. Man sent to threaten brought backup. A man sent with a specific offer came alone. Nathan met him in the yard again. Mr. Marsh has a proposal, Briggs said. He had the manner of a man who was mildly embarrassed by his own errand. He's willing to drop the warrant entirely. He'll have Foley dismiss the charges, clear Miss Whitmore's name from the court record. No debt, no property claim, none of it. Nathan looked at him. In exchange for what? She comes back to Dunmore. Briggs paused. Voluntarily. Just she comes back. That's all he's asking. That's not all he's asking, Nathan said. Briggs had the decency to look at the ground for a moment. Those are the terms as I was given them. And you believe him? That he'd clear the warrant and leave her alone after she came back? A pause that was its own answer. That's what I thought, Nathan said. He turned and went inside and closed the door, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. Clara was standing in the middle of the room when he came in. She had heard everything through the door, and her face had gone through several expressions and arrived at something that was mostly resolution, with a layer of exhaustion underneath. He wants me back, she said. He wants you where he can reach you. Same thing. She sat down. For the first time since she'd arrived on the mountain, she looked tired in a way that went deeper than the body. Nathan, I've been fighting this for 7 months. And she stopped, started again. I am not giving up. I want to be clear about that. I am not going back and I am not surrendering. I am very tired of being the thing that a man with money uses to prove he can't be told no. Nathan crossed to the table and sat down across from her. He put his hands flat on the wood, which was a gesture she'd noticed before, the gesture of a man grounding himself before saying something he'd decided on. Clara, he said, I need to tell you something. She looked at him. When my wife died, he said, I came up here because I didn't know what else to do with the size of what I'd lost. I told myself it was peace I was after. Quiet. I told myself that people were trouble and distance was sense. He stopped for a moment. I was wrong about most of that. She waited. What I was actually doing, he said, was making sure I would never have to be the person standing beside someone who needed me and finding out I wasn't enough to help. His voice was level, but the levelness cost him. That's a different thing from wanting peace. That's fear, wearing the shape of principle. Clara was very still. I've been afraid of not being enough since the day I buried them, he said. And I am telling you this right now because Gerald Marsh is going to send more men, or worse than men. And I want you to know before that happens that I am not going to let that fear make me useless to you. I am standing here. Whatever comes up that trail, I am standing here. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent 10 years on a mountain, making himself unreachable. This man who loaded rifles with quiet competence and checked the traps every other day and had reorganized his entire vocabulary of solitude because she had arrived on a bad knee with a skinning knife and refused to perform helplessness. You've been enough, she said. Since the first morning. You just haven't let yourself know it. He looked at her. Something in him that had been held at a very particular tension for a very long time shifted, not broke. Not collapsed, just shifted, the way a door shifts when someone finally turns the handle. Before either of them could say anything else, there was a sound from outside. Not the sound of a horse on the trail, the sound of something closer. Nathan was on his feet before he'd consciously decided to move. He went to the window and looked, and what he saw made him turn back to Clara with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not fear, exactly, but its more focused and actionable cousin. There are 3 of them, he said. Coming up the south approach. Not the trail, the slope, the south approach. Not the way anyone came who was making a social call. The way you came if you didn't want to be seen until you were already at the cabin. Clara had the revolver in her hand before he finished the sentence. Briggs, she said, one of them. He was already at the rifle. The other 2 are new. Marsh escalated. Yes. She moved to the far side of the room, the angle that gave her sight of the door and the window simultaneously. Her hands were steady. Nathan noticed, split second he had to notice anything, that they were entirely steady. Nathan, she said, don't get shot. That's the plan, he said. Then the first knock came at the door, heavy, deliberate, the knock of someone who wanted to be heard and was not particularly concerned about etiquette. Nathan looked at Clara. She nodded. He opened the door. Briggs stood on the porch. Behind him, visible at the corners of the cabin, were 2 men Nathan had not seen before. Both positioned. Both with the stillness of men who'd been told where to stand and why. Mr. Cole, Briggs's voice was different now. The mild embarrassment was gone. It was a man delivering a final message. Mr. Marsh has asked me to inform you that his patience with this situation has concluded. Miss Whitmore will be coming back to Dunmore tonight. Her cooperation is preferred. It is not required. Nathan looked at Briggs. He looked at the 2 men at the corners of the cabin. He looked back at Briggs. Briggs, he said, I'm going to give you one chance to take those men and ride back down the mountain. Mr. Cole, I know this terrain. Nay, Nathan said, still in the same level tone that had not risen and would not, like I know my own name. I have hunted, worked, and lived on every foot of this slope for 10 years. Those 2 men at my corners think they're positioned well. They're not. And I want you to think very carefully about whether Gerald Marsh is paying you enough to find out what that means. Briggs held his gaze for a long moment. Then from inside the cabin came Clara's voice. Calm and clear and absolutely without tremor, Mr. I have a letter in my hand from the Federal Land Office in Denver confirming a formal investigation into Gerald Marsh's land acquisition practices in the Dunmore territory. That investigation includes the title transfer of the schoolhouse, the warrant filed by Judge Foley, and 3 other property claims that federal records show were filed within 6 months of Marsh acquiring land adjacent to the claimed properties. A pause. If you remove me from this mountain by force, you become part of a federal obstruction case. I would like you to consider that before you decide what to do next. Silence. Briggs looked past Nathan into the cabin. Clara stood in the center of the room, revolver at her side, a piece of paper in her other hand. Nay, She looked at Briggs with the complete steady attention of a woman who had made 11-year-old girls believe in their own mathematical minds and was fully prepared to apply the same energy to this situation. "That letter," Briggs said, "is real," Clarissa said. "Patterson sent it this morning. It arrived with the supply rider 2 hours ago." Another silence. Nathan watched the calculation happening behind Briggs's eyes, the very visible process of a man deciding what his job was actually worth. "I'll need to," Briggs started. "You can verify it in Denver," Clara said. "That's where the federal office is. That's where the investigation is being run. That's where Gerald Marsh is going to have to answer for what he's done, and every man who helped him do it." She looked at Briggs steadily. "Or you can ride back to Dunmore tonight and tell Mr. Marsh that he has a problem considerably larger than a schoolteacher who said no to his proposal." Briggs stood on the porch for a moment that stretched out into the mountain evening. And he turned around. He said something to the man at the near corner, too low to hear clearly, and that man moved, and the sound from the far side of the cabin changed, the particular sound of people deciding to leave. Briggs looked back at Nathan. He started to say something. Then he appeared to decide against it. He turned and walked back through the gate. Nathan watched until the sound of 3 horses on the trail had faded completely. And he turned around and looked at Clara. She set the letter down on the table. "Patterson's letter came this morning," Nathan said. "It did. What does it actually say?" She looked at him. "That he's reviewing the warrant. That the jurisdictional question is being assessed. That he appreciates the information provided and will be in contact when there are developments." She paused. "Which is more or less what I told Briggs. I simply arranged the words differently." Nathan stared at her. "You bluffed him," he said. "I told him the truth," she said with a precision that would have impressed a lawyer. "I told him the investigation was real, which it is. I told him the letter was from Patterson, which it is. I told him the warrant and the property transfers were under federal scrutiny, which they are." She met his eyes without blinking. "I did not tell him how far along that scrutiny was." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. "Gerald Marsh," he said, "me, very slowly, met men up this mountain to forcibly remove you, and you stopped them with a letter that said essentially nothing useful and a rearrangement of the words." "And a revolver," she said. "Don't forget the revolver." Something happened on Nathan Cole's face. It started in the corner of his eyes and worked its way down, and it was completely unfamiliar and entirely unmistakable. Laughed. A real laugh. Short and surprised and deeper than it expected. The laugh of a man who has been caught entirely off guard by something that delights him. It was the first time she'd heard him laugh. Clara looked at him, and something happened in her own chest that she recognized and did not immediately know what to do with. "We bought time," she said, bringing them both back to ground. "That's all. Marsh is going to find out the letter is thinner than I made it sound. And we need Patterson to move faster than he's been moving." "Nay," Nathan said, laughter gone, but the lightness not entirely, something remaining in his expression that had not been there before. "And we need Ruth to be safe. Yes, and we need to be ready for when Marsh decides that legal channels aren't working. Also, yes." He looked at her. Across the table, across the space between them that had been narrowing steadily, since the morning she'd walked into his cabin with a bad knee and $17, and a complete unwillingness to make herself smaller. He said. She looked at him. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Without decoration, she held his gaze for a moment. Then she said with equal simplicity, "So am I." Outside, the summer evening was settling over the mountain. Somewhere below them, in a house full of the trappings of respectability, Gerald Marsh was reading Briggs's report and making decisions. Somewhere in Denver, a federal officer named Patterson was looking at land records and finding things that were not supposed to be findable. Somewhere in Dunmore, Ruth Adler was going about her business with the particular careful courage of a woman who had decided what side she was on. And on a mountain in Colorado, 2 people who had each arrived at their solitude by different roads stood on the other side of the hardest conversation they'd yet had and looked at each other without flinching. The fire needed tending. The letters needed writing. The morning would bring whatever it brought, and they would meet it the way they'd met everything since the beginning, standing beside each other, not behind. Clara reached for the coffee pot. Nathan picked up the pen. Patterson's next letter arrived on a Wednesday, and it changed everything. Nathan heard the supply rider coming up the valley before dawn, which was unusual enough that he was already dressed and standing in the yard by the time the man reached the gate. The rider looked like he hadn't slept. He handed over 2 letters without dismounting and said only that the federal man in Denver had paid for priority delivery, which meant someone had paid considerably more than the standard rate to before this arrived fast. Nathan took both letters inside. Clara was awake. She'd heard the horse, too, and she was at the table with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her eyes carrying the particular alertness of someone who had not been sleeping as soundly as she pretended. He set the letters on the table, one from Patterson, one in handwriting they both recognized as Ruth's. Patterson first, Clara said. He opened it and read it aloud. And Patterson had found something. Not just something, several somethings. The kind of somethings that accumulated into a pattern so clear it was almost insulting in its obviousness once you knew where to look. In the past 4 years, Gerald Marsh had filed 11 property claims in the Dunmore Territorial District. 7 of those claims had been filed within 60 days of the previous owner encountering some form of legal difficulty, a debt claim, a warrant, a civil dispute difficulties that, in 6 of the 7 cases, had been initiated by complaints filed through Deputy Creel's office. The schoolhouse transfer was the most recent. It was also the sloppiest, because Marsh had done it quickly, assuming that a schoolteacher without money or connections would not be in a position to make the transfer worth examining. He had miscalculated. Patterson had contacted 2 other federal officers, one in the territorial capital and one in Washington. He had formal authorization to proceed with a full investigation. Judge Foley's warrant for Clara had been suspended pending review of the circumstances under which it was issued, and Patterson had submitted a formal request with documentation for a federal marshal to be assigned to the Dunmore case. Clara stopped breathing for approximately 4 seconds in the middle of the letter. When Nathan finished reading, the room was very quiet. Foley's warrant is suspended, she said. Yes, I'm not a wanted woman. Not legally, not right now. She put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. Nathan watched her work through it, the careful, deliberate processing of a person who had learned not to show too much until they were sure what they were showing was warranted. Ruth's letter, she said. He opened it. Ruth's letter was shorter and considerably more alarming. Nathan, I don't have much time to write. Marsh knows about Patterson's investigation. I don't know how, but he knows. 3 days ago, he called a town meeting and told everyone that Clara had fabricated false claims against him to a federal officer and that the investigation was an attempt to damage the reputation of an innocent man. Half the town believes him. The other half is afraid to say otherwise. He's also started asking questions about who might have provided information to Denver. My name hasn't come up yet, but I don't think that will last. More important, Marsh sent a man to Denver 2 days ago. Not Briggs. Someone I've never seen before. I think he's trying to find out what Patterson actually has before Patterson can act on it. He's not retreating, he's reorganizing. Nathan set the letter down. Clara had been reading it at the same time, leaning across the table, and when she straightened up, her jaw was set in the way that meant she was angry enough to be completely calm. He's going after Patterson, she said, trying to find out what he has. Maybe trying to find a way to discredit it, or discredit Patterson. She stood up and moved to the window. Not to look at anything in particular, just because sitting still had become impossible. If Marsh could paint Patterson as someone pursuing a social personal vendetta or make the investigation look politically motivated, he can tie it up for months. Years. He's done it before. I just didn't know about the other cases when I was in Dunmore. Ruth could be in danger, Nathan said. I know, if Marsh figures out she's his source. No. She turned around. We have to go to Dunmore. A. The words landed in the room with the weight of something that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived at its natural conclusion. Nathan looked at her. You want to walk back into the town that drove you out? I want to walk back into that town with Patterson's documentation, Ruth Adler beside me, and the names of 11 property owners whose land Marsh stole through legal manipulation. She held his gaze. I am not walking back to beg. I am walking back to finish it. Nathan was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the 2 letters on the table. He looked at Clara. He looked at the window. I haven't been to Dunmore in 10 years, he said. I know. I haven't been anywhere with more than 3 people in 10 years. Know that too. She crossed back to the table. Nathan. I am not asking you to come. I mean that this is not the kind of thing I want you to do because you feel obligated. You've already done more than stop, he said. She stopped. I told you, he said, that I was going to stand here. Whatever came up the trail. He picked up Patterson's letter and folded it carefully. Dunmore is just the trail going the other direction. Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, We'll need to send word to Patterson before we go. Tell him what Marsh is doing in Denver. Give him time to protect what he's built. And Ruth. When do we leave? She thought about it for exactly as long as it needed. Enough time to write the letters, get the horse ready, and put together what we need to take with us. Nathan nodded. He picked up the pen from the shelf and set it on the table in front of her. You write better than I do, he said. She sat down and started writing. They left on a Friday morning, before the heat settled in, with 2 horses and a saddlebag that contained Patterson's letters, Clara's own documentation of the events in Dunmore, and a list of 11 names that Ruth had provided across 3 separate letters without ever quite saying what she was providing. The ride down the mountain was different from everything that had happened on it. On the mountain, they had been in Nathan's territory, which meant they had operated with the particular confidence of people who knew the ground under their feet. The valley was different. The trail back toward Dunmore was different. And Nathan, who had not traveled this road in 10 years, was different. Clara noticed it in the set of his shoulders. Not fear she'd come to know what Nathan Cole looked like when he was afraid, and this wasn't it. It was something closer to the deliberate steadying of a man who had put down a very heavy thing long ago and was now choosing to pick it up again. She didn't comment on it. She rode beside him and let him be whatever he needed to be. About 3 miles down the valley, he said, and, without looking at her, she was afraid of thunderstorms. Clara waited. Emma, my wife. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. Every storm, no matter how small. She'd sit in the corner of the kitchen with her hands over her ears. A pause. My daughter thought it was funny. She'd sit next to her mother and hold her hands and tell her the thunder was just the mountains talking. Another pause, longer. She was 4 years old. What was her name? Clara asked. Lily. That's a good name. She chose it herself, more or less. Emma wanted something more formal. But Lily heard the word somewhere when she was 2 and just decided. That was who she was going to be. He was quiet for a moment. She was the most decisive person I've ever met, and she was 4 years old. Clara said nothing. She understood that this was not a conversation that needed her to say much. Needed her to be present, which was a different and more demanding thing. I haven't said their names out loud in a long time, Nathan said. Emma and Lily, Clara said. He looked at her. Something in his face that had been held very still for a very long time was no longer entirely still. Yes, he said. They rode on. Nay. They reached the outskirts of Dunmore late on the second day, and Clara felt the town before she saw it, the particular atmospheric quality of a place that has been the site of her humiliation and has not yet been required to account for it. She sat straighter in the saddle. Ruth's store is on the main street, she said. East End past the bank. I know where it is, Nathan said. She glanced at him. Of course he did. He'd lived in this valley once, before the mountain, before 10 years of deliberate distance. She kept forgetting that, because the Nathan she knew was so completely the mountain that it was hard to picture him anywhere else. We go to Ruth first, he said. Find out what Marsh knows about Patterson's man in Denver. We decide the next step. Agreed. They came into Dunmore just as the evening was settling, which was deliberate fewer people in the street, less spectacle, more time to get to Ruth before anyone who mattered to Marsh could send word that they'd arrived. It didn't entirely work. They were halfway down the main street when Clara heard someone say her name. Not loudly, a surprised exhale almost, from the doorway of the hardware store. She looked over and saw a man she recognized, Tom Lester, who'd had a son in her class, who'd been on the school board, who'd voted to dismiss her without meeting her eyes when he did it. He stared at her. She looked at him with the calm, direct gaze she'd been practicing since before she could remember. She did not stop writing. Nathan was watching her from under the brim of his hat, with the particular attention of a man cataloging things he might need to know later. "He'll tell someone," he said quietly. "I know. We have about 20 minutes before this becomes complicated." They pushed the horses to a faster walk. Ruth Adler's dry goods store had a light in the back window, which meant she was doing the end-of-day accounting. Clara knew this because she'd spent enough evenings talking to Ruth through exactly that window in the months when Marsh's campaign against her was building, and Ruth was the only person in town willing to say plainly what she saw happening. Nathan knocked. 3 times. Specific a pattern, Clara realized, that Ruth must have told him to use years ago. Because the door opened before the knock was fully finished, and Ruth Adler was standing in the doorway looking at them with the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something to happen and is relieved and terrified in equal measure that it has finally started. Ace. She was small and sharp-eyed, somewhere north of 60, with the bearing of a woman who had built her business by being smarter than most of the men who'd tried to undercut her and had never once let them know she knew it. "Nathan Cole," she said. "Lord Almighty, Ruth, you look terrible." "You look exactly the same. I look old." She moved back from the door. "In here, both of you, before someone who owes Marsh money sees you and runs to tell him." They got inside. Ruth shut the door and locked it, and turned to look at Clara with an expression that contained about 7 different things at once. "Came back," Ruth said. "I came back," Clara confirmed. "Marsh is going to—" "I know what Marsh is going to do," Clara said. "That's why I'm here. Tell me about the man he sent to Denver." Ruth sat down on the stool behind her counter and folded her hands in her lap, which what she did when she was about to say something she didn't like. "His name is Carver. He's been to Denver before. I've heard Marsh mention him twice in the last year, always in connection with situations that needed to be made to go away." She looked at Nathan. "Not like Briggs. Briggs is muscle. Carver is smarter." What is he doing in Denver?" Nathan asked. "From what I can piece together from what I've heard in this store, because men talk in front of women they consider furniture. Carver isn't going after Patterson's evidence. He's going after Patterson himself." Ruth looked at Clara. "He's putting together a complaint that Patterson has a personal connection to you. See? That you and Patterson knew each other before. That the investigation isn't federal procedure, but a personal favor." Clara went very still. "Patterson and I have never met." "I know that. You know that. Carver is going to Denver to find someone who'll say otherwise for the right amount of money." The room was quiet. Nathan spoke first. "How long has Carver been in Denver?" "Maybe 5. Nathan looked at Clara. "We need to get word to Patterson tonight, before Carver finds his witness." "He wrote to him before we left the mountain," Clara said. "Carver moves fast." "There's a telegraph office," Ruth said. "Jenkins runs it. He's not in Marsh's pocket. His brother lost land to Marsh 2 years ago, and Jenkins has been waiting for an opportunity to be useful ever since." She looked at them steadily. "If you want to send Patterson a wire tonight, Jenkins will send it." "Can he keep it quiet until morning?" Nathan asked. "For 24 hours, maybe. After that, Marsh has enough people watching that building that it'll get back to him." Nathan stood up. "Then I'll go tonight now." Clara looked at him. "Marsh's men will be watching. They'll be watching for you," he said. "See? They don't know I'm here yet." "Yeah. And I'm not a woman who's been run out of town. I'm just a man who used to live in this valley and apparently decided to visit it. He looked at her with the particular steadiness that she'd come to understand and was his version of reassurance. I'll be 30 minutes. Stay here with Ruth. Nathan. Clara. He said her name the way he'd been saying it for weeks now, with the weight of something that had been accumulating, simple, direct, and more than simple and direct. I'll be back. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He put his hat on and went out the back door. The 20 minutes that followed were the longest Clara could remember since leaving Dunmore. She sat with Ruth, and Ruth made tea because Ruth made tea in every crisis, and they talked in low voices about what Marsh had done to the town in Clara's absence, which was a depressing and entirely predictable list of things. The Hendersons lost their eastern pasture, Ruth said. Marsh filed a boundary dispute 3 weeks after you left. The Hendersons couldn't afford a lawyer. She set her cup down. Tom Lester's been sick with guilt for 6 months. He knows what he did, voting you out. Doesn't know what to do about it. He could testify, Clara said, about the school board meeting. About how the vote happened. Who applied pressure and how. Ruth looked at her. You think he'd do it? I think he might if someone made it clear to him that doing nothing has a cost too. Clara looked at her hands. Men like Lester aren't evil. They're weak. And weakness can go either direction if you give it the right push. Ruth was quiet for a moment. You've changed, she said. Have I? You left here angry and hurt and trying not to show either. Ruth looked at her with the sharp, clear attention that had always seen through Clara's composure to whatever was underneath it. You came back clear, like you know exactly what you're doing. Considered that. I had time to think, she said. And someone to think alongside. Ruth glanced at the back door. Good man. He is. He was a wreck when he left this valley 10 years ago. I didn't think he'd ever come back to anything. She paused. I'm glad I was wrong. So am I, Clara said very quietly. Nathan came back in 23 minutes, which she knew because she'd been counting. Sat down at the table and said, without preamble, wire is sent. Jenkins will confirm receipt tomorrow morning. Patterson will have it before Carver has time to finish his business in Denver. F. Patterson checks his messages at his usual time. And no one saw you? Creel was outside the saloon, but he was occupied. He looked at Clara. We have tonight to plan. Tomorrow, Marsh finds out we're here. Then we should be ready before tomorrow, Clara said. What does ready look like? Ruth asked. Clara looked at Nathan. Nettie. He looked at her. Yeah. And in that exchange was something that had been building since the first morning. The first coffee. The first fence post. The first letter. The first time he'd said we, without seeming to notice he'd said it. Clara said, means we stop waiting for Marsh to make the next move and we make ours first. She reached into the ladle bag she'd carried inside and put Patterson's documentation on Ruth's counter, every letter, every property record, every name from Ruth's own list cross-referenced with the dates. Marsh had filed his complaints. I need to know which of those 11 property owners are still in this town, she said. And I need to know which ones are angry enough to walk into a room and say what happened to them. Ruth looked at the papers. She picked up the list and ran her finger down it. Her expression changed as she read, solidified into something that had the quality of a long-held frustration, finally finding its shape. Aldwell, she said, lost the north pasture 18 months ago. Still furious, he told me last spring he'd give 10 years of his life to see Marsh answer for it. She moved to the next name. Holt. The mill property. His wife has been sick and the settlement money was supposed to cover the doctor bills. It didn't because the settlement was Marsh's terms. She looked up. If you're asking who'd stand up and say it out loud in front of a federal officer, the answer is at least 6 of these 11. Maybe enough, Clara said. Enough for what exactly? Ruth asked. Enough for a hearing. Clara looked at Nathan. If Patterson can get a federal marshal here within the week, which his letter suggested was possible, we don't need a territorial judge. We don't need Foley. We go federal. Nathan was watching her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of being impressed, which was to say his expression didn't change much, but his eyes did. Nooner. You've been planning this since before we left the mountain. Yeah. I've been planning it since the morning we read Patterson's first letter, she said. I just needed to know the ground was solid before I told you the whole plan. It was quiet for a moment. Then, what's the part you haven't told me yet? She met his eyes. I need to go see Tom Lester. The silence was immediate and specific. Ruth started. He saw me ride in. He knows I'm here. If I don't go to him, he goes to Marsh before morning to prove his loyalty. She kept her eyes on Nathan. But if I go to him tonight, and I put Patterson's papers in front of him, and I give him a way to do the right thing that doesn't require more courage than he actually has. He could warn Marsh, Nathan said. He could, she agreed. Or he could decide that protecting Gerald Marsh isn't worth what it costs him to look at himself in the morning. Another silence. Ruth was looking at the table. I'll go with you, Nathan said. Don't have to. Just her name. Quiet and final. He looked at him. I know I don't have to, he said. Igwang. I'm going. Anne. Tom Lester answered his door on the second knock, and when he saw Clara Whitmore standing on his porch in the evening dark with Nathan Cole beside her, his face went through 4 distinct expressions in approximately 2 seconds. The fourth one settled into something that looked in the bad light like relief. Miss Whitmore, he said. Her voice was even. Think you know why I'm here? He looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him with the patient, direct attention of a man who has nothing to prove and no interest in pretense. You'd better come in, Lester said. They came in. Yeah. The house smelled like supper and children. There were 2 of them visible at the far end of the room, young enough to be herded to bed by Lester's wife, who took one look at the situation and did exactly that without being asked. Esther sat down. Clara put Patterson's papers on the table. It's done this 11 times, she said, to 11 families in this territory. You were on the board that removed me from the school. That was one piece of it. This is the whole picture. Lester looked at the papers. He was a man of maybe 50, worn in the way that working land wears a man, with the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time making a decision he hadn't quite admitted to himself he'd already made. Read for a long time. A federal marshal, he said finally. Coming within the week if Patterson can move fast enough. Marsh will fight it. He'll try. She leaned forward. Mr. Lester, I'm not here to make you feel guilty. What's done is done, and I am past wanting anyone in this town to feel badly about what they didn't do 6 months ago. She paused. I'm here because Gerald Marsh has done this to families, and the only way to stop him from doing it to 11 more is for the people who watched it happen to say what they saw. In front of a federal officer, on the record, Lester was quiet for a long time. My boy, he said, Daniel. He was in your class. Was. 3rd row, excellent reader. Struggled with long division. Something moved across Lester's face. He cried when you left. Wouldn't eat dinner that night. He looked at the papers. I told him it was the right decision. That the board had to. That there were reasons to stop. Mr. Lester, Nathan said. It was the first thing he'd said since sitting down, and both Lester and Clara looked at him. The reasons you told your boy were not true. You know that. He probably knows that. The question is what you do about it. Lester looked at Nathan Cole, this man from the mountain, who had come back to a valley he'd left in grief. Sitting in his kitchen, in the dark with his hat on the table, and the particular expression of someone who has done the reckoning that Lester himself had been avoiding. If I testify, Lester said. When you testify, Clara said. A beat. What happens to my family? Marsh owns the mortgage on my east field. Patterson's investigation covers fraudulent debt instruments, Clara said. If that mortgage was used as leverage to influence a public proceeding, which it was, because that's exactly what happened at the school board vote, it becomes part of the federal case. Marsh can't call it in while it's under federal scrutiny. Esther looked at the papers again. Then he looked at Clara. I'm sorry, he said, for what we did to you. She held his gaze for a moment. The apology was real. She could tell the difference between a real apology and a performed one. She'd received enough of both. "I know you are," she said. "Make it mean something." Lester picked up the first page of Patterson's documentation and started reading it again, more carefully this time. Nathan caught Clara's eye across the table. He tilted his head slightly toward the door. They should give Lester space to finish deciding what he'd already decided. She nodded. They stepped out onto the porch and stood in the night air, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The town of Dunmore was quiet around them, the ordinary quiet of an evening that did not yet know what was coming. "We're staying tonight?" Nathan asked. "Ruth has a room at the back of the store." They offered. Clara looked at the dark street. "Marsh finds out we're here tomorrow." "Need to be ready." "We will be." She turned to look at him. "Nah." In the dark, with Dunmore quiet around them, and Patterson's papers inside being read by a man who was almost ready to do the right thing, Clara looked at Nathan Cole and saw, without any ambiguity, exactly what he was. Not a man hiding, not a man running. A man who had chosen, with full knowledge of what it cost, to stop moving away from things and start moving toward them. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah, when this is over." She stopped. Stated again. "When Marsh is answered for, and the warrant is gone, and whoever needs to testify has testified." When it's done, he looked at her steadily. Waiting. Not pushing. Never pushing. "I don't want to go to Harker's Ridge alone," she said. Night was very quiet. "You won't," he said. Not a promise dressed up as a declaration. Just plain undecorated fact stated by a man who had said very few things in 10 years, but had not once said something he didn't mean. Clara looked at him for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the door. "We should go back in," she said. "Lester needs witnesses when he signs the statement." "All right." She reached for the door handle. Nathan put his hand on the door beside her hand, not touching. Just there, the gesture of a man making himself present without demanding anything in return. She pushed the door open. They went back inside together. And, in Denver, a federal officer named Patterson was reading a telegraph message by lamplight, and reading it twice, and reaching for his pen with the expression of a man who had been looking for a reason to move fast, and had just been handed one. And in Dunmore, at the far end of town in a house full of the trappings of respectability, Gerald Marsh was sitting with a glass of whiskey he hadn't drunk, staring at the window. With the first faint and unfamiliar feeling of a man who has built his power on other people's silence, beginning to suspect that the silence was ending. Tom Lester signed the statement at 11 o'clock that night. He signed it with the particular deliberateness of a man who understood that a signature was not the end of something but the beginning, and that beginnings of this kind could not be unsigned. His hand was steady. Clara witnessed it. Nathan witnessed it. Ruth Adler, who had come across town with her coat over her nightdress and her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, witnessed it with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for this specific moment for approximately 18 months. "Who else?" to Nathan asked when Lester had set down the pen. "Eldwell," Ruth said. "He stays up late, always has." She looked at the clock on Lester's wall. "And Margaret Holt. Her husband's asleep by 8, but she handles all the paperwork. She'll know exactly what we need from the mill property case, and she'll sign anything that moves this forward." "We go to them tonight," Clara said. "Before morning." Lester looked up from the table. "I'll come with you." "Aldwell, at least. He trusts me more than he trusts." He stopped. Looked at Clara. "More than he trusts people he doesn't know." "No offense meant. None," Clara said. "Come on." They went out into the Dunmore night. 4 people, moving quietly through a town that was mostly asleep and entirely unaware of what was being assembled in its streets. Ruth knew which houses had dogs and which didn't. Lester knew which gate latches were loud. Nathan moved behind all of them, with the habitual silence of a man who had spent 10 years on a mountain and had very good ears. Caldwell opened his door before they knocked, which meant he'd heard the gate. He was a big man, rangy, with the look of someone who'd been doing hard work for a long time and had a precise accounting in his mind of everything that had been taken from him. He looked at Clara first. "You're the school teacher," he said. "Damn, Marsh ran you off." He tried. She looked at him steadily. "He's been doing the same thing to everyone on this list for 4 years." She handed him the paper with the 11 names. He read it in the lamplight from his doorway, and as he read, his expression moved through several things and arrived at something cold and settled and entirely decided. "Who do I sign?" He signed. Margaret Holt signed, sitting at her kitchen table at midnight with the mill property documents spread around her and a calm fury in her eyes that had clearly been there for a long time and was relieved to finally have somewhere to go. An old man named Deaver, who'd lost a water rights claim 2 years ago and hadn't spoken to a lawyer since because he couldn't afford one, opened his door in his nightclothes and signed before Clara had finished explaining what the signature was for. By 2 a.m. they had 6 signed statements, Patterson's documentation, and the telegraph confirmation from Jenkins that Patterson had received the wire and responded with 2 words, "Inshall, coming." They went back to Ruth's store, and Ruth made coffee. The 4 of them, Clara, Nathan, Ruth, Tom Lester, sat around Ruth's back room table in the small hours of the morning and looked at what they had built. "Marsh finds out about the marshal, and he'll move," Lester said. "He'll try to discredit the witnesses before they can testify formally." "How?" Nathan asked. "He'll call in debts. Caldwell's got a note with the Dunmore Bank and Marsh is majority shareholder." "And with Deaver." Lester looked at his hands. "Same with me." Abel was quiet for a moment. "How much?" Clara asked. Lester told her. She didn't flinch at the number. Nathan didn't either. "Patterson's letter," Nathan said to Clara. "The part about fraudulent debt instruments being under federal review." "Yes," she said. "Any debt Marsh calls in while the investigation is active becomes evidence of obstruction." She looked at Lester. "He can threaten to call it in, but if he does, he hands Patterson exactly what he needs to add obstruction of federal proceedings to the original charges." Lester absorbed it. "He might do it anyway, just to punish." "He might," Clara said. "That's a risk you're taking." "I won't pretend otherwise." Lester looked at the signed statement in front of him. Then he looked at Clara with the expression of a man who has finished making a decision that has actually been made for some time. He said, "Daniel, he's 9 years old and he already knows that I let a good teacher get driven out of his school because I was afraid of a powerful man." He paused. "I'd like him to know the rest of the story, too." Ruth reached over and put her hand on Lester's arm briefly and said nothing, which was exactly right. Nathan looked at the table. Then he looked at Clara. She met his eyes, and in them she saw something she recognized because she had been watching it develop for weeks. The expression of a man back from the place he'd retreated to and found, to his genuine surprise, that the world he'd retreated from was worth the return. "Get some sleep," he said to the room. "Marshall will be here in a few days. We need to be ready when he arrives." "Where will you sleep?" Ruth asked Nathan. "I'll be fine. There's a cot in the storeroom," Ruth said, with the tone of a woman who was not asking. "And I'll take the cot," he said. Clara caught his eye as they were all standing to go. "Just for a moment." He held her gaze and gave her the small, certain nod that she had learned was his version of "we're all right." She gave it back to him. They went to sleep in Ruth Adler's back rooms, and outside, Dunmore was quiet, and Gerald Marsh was still awake in his large house, and did not yet know what the night had assembled against him. Marsh found out at breakfast. Clara knew the exact moment because she was standing at Ruth's front window with her coffee when she saw Creel come out of the hotel across the street, walk fast toward the east end of town, and not come back. 20 minutes later, she saw him again heading in the other direction, and his walk had changed, the walk of a man who has been given urgent instructions and is trying to look like he hasn't. "He's telling Marsh's people," she said. Nathan was behind her. He'd been awake since before her, which she suspected had been true for most of the time they'd been on the mountain, and she'd only been sleeping well enough not to notice. "How many men do you think Marsh has in town who'd act on instructions this morning?" "Creel, maybe 2 others. Briggs is back. I saw his horse at the livery last night." She turned from the window. He's not going to do anything physical. Not with a federal marshal already on the way. No, Nathan agreed. He's going to try to talk. He'll want to negotiate. He'll want to make an offer. Same thing, they looked at each other. He'll come here, Clara said. He'll want to speak to me privately. Somewhere he thinks he controls. He'll want to separate us, Nathan said. She put her coffee cup down. So we don't separate. Agreed. Ruth came in from the back, already dressed, already sharp. I can see the window from behind my counter, she said. If someone comes to the door I don't recognize, I'll know before they knock. Marsh himself, Nathan asked. He won't come himself, Ruth said. He'll send Creel. She paused, though. She tilted her head. He's never had someone actually come back before. All the other people he moved against, they left or they gave up, or they didn't have anyone to help them. You coming back here with federal papers and a string of signed statements, that's new for him. She looked at Clara. He ain't come himself, if he's frightened enough. Good, Clara said. Creel came at 9 o'clock. He knocked with the authority of a man who considered himself entitled to an answer. And Ruth opened the door with the authority of a woman on her own property who had not given him permission to have any particular expectations about how the door would be answered. Miss Whitmore, Creel said, looking past Ruth to where Clara stood in the middle of the store. Mr. Marsh would like a word. I'm sure he would, Clara said. In private. No, Creel looked at Nathan. Nathan looked back at him with the patient, complete attention. He applied to everything, not threatening, not deferential, just present in the way that a large, unhurried man who has nothing to prove is present. Miss Whitmore, Creel said, returning to her. Mr. Marsh is a reasonable Deputy Creel. Clara's voice was entirely even. You signed a warrant based on a fraudulent property claim. That signature is currently part of a federal investigation into Gerald Marsh's land acquisition practices. Federal marshal, who is coming to this town in the next 72 hours, will have questions for you. She paused. I'd suggest you spend the time between now and then thinking carefully about whether your loyalty to Gerald Marsh is worth the answers you're going to have to give. Creel's face went through several things. You're making serious accusations, he said. I'm stating documented facts, she said. There's a difference. Mr. Marsh taught me that. Actually, the importance of documentation. Taking it to heart, Creel left. He came back 40 minutes later. This time, Gerald Marsh was with him. Clara had not seen Marsh since the morning she'd left Dunmore, and the sight of him walking through Ruth Adler's door hit her with a physical force she had not entirely anticipated, not fear. She was past fear of him. But something cold and clarifying, the sensation of a thing that had been abstract becoming concrete again. He was not what people who hadn't met him expected. He was not large or loud or visibly menacing. He was medium height, well-dressed, with gray at his temples and the practiced pleasantness of a man who had spent decades being the most powerful person in every room he entered and had learned to wear that power lightly enough that people occasionally forgot it was there. He looked at Clara. He did not look at Nathan or Ruth. Miss Whitmore, he said. His voice had the warmth of something that had never been warm. I'm glad you're well, Mr. Marsh, she said. I think there's been a considerable misunderstanding. There hasn't been, she said. He stopped. The pleasantness shifted slightly, recalibrated. When was a formality, a misapplication of. The warrant was filed by a judge who owes you money, based on a property claim you manufactured using a school board vote you coerced. Her voice did not rise. You have documentation for each of those statements. So does the Federal Land Office in Denver. So does the marshal who is currently traveling to Dunmore. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness was still there. It was the kind of pleasantness that did not leave because it was not actually pleasantness. It was a mask, and the mask was structural. Then he looked at Nathan, and something changed. Cole, he said. Nathan said nothing. I didn't know you were involved in this. I am now, Nathan said. This isn't your business. She's my biz, Nathan said, simply, without drama or performance. The same way he said everything that mattered. Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at Clara, and what she saw in his face in that moment was not the pleasantness and not the mask underneath it, but the thing under the mask, the cold. Fundamental reality of a man who had never once been held accountable for anything and was encountering, for the first time, the serious possibility that he was about to be. "What do you want?" he said. The pleasantness was entirely gone. "I want what belongs to the people you took it from," Clara said. "North pasture that belongs to Caldwell. The mill property that the Holts paid for." Rights that Deaver held. For 20 years before you filed a dispute you knew was fraudulent. She did not look at her notes. She didn't need to. I want Judge Foley to answer for every warrant he's signed at your table. I want the school returned to public trust and removed from your land company's deed. And I want a formal public record in the territorial court of what you have done in this county for 4 years. Marsh looked at her. "And if I decline," he said, "then the federal marshal arrives, and the people who signed statements last night testify, and Patterson presents his documentation. And you answer for 11 counts of fraudulent property acquisition and 1 count of suborning a public official." She held his gaze. "That's the alternative." The room was very quiet. Creel, standing behind Marsh, was looking at the floor. Marsh looked at Clara with the focused attention of a man making a calculation. She had seen that look before, in the months leading up to her departure from Dunmore, and she had been afraid of it then, because she had not known what he was calculating. She was not afraid of it now. She knew exactly what he was calculating, and she knew that however he calculated it, the numbers did not come out in his favor. "I'll need to speak with my lawyer," he said. "Of course," Clara said. "The marshal will be here in approximately 70 hours. You have until then." Marsh turned and walked out of Ruth Adler's store without another word. Creel followed him, and the door closed. And then there was a silence in the store that lasted about 4 seconds before Ruth sat down on her stool and let out a breath that sounded like it had been held since approximately the previous autumn. "Lord Almighty," Ruth said. Nathan looked at Clara. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and she was. And she was entirely and completely, specifically all right. Not the fragile all right of someone performing composure, but the solid, grounded all right of someone who has done the thing they came to do and can feel the ground under their feet. Nathan sat across from her. "He'll negotiate," she said. "He'll try to. He'll offer to settle quietly. Return some of the property, make the warrant disappear, ask everyone to agree to forget." "And the answer is no." She looked at Nathan steadily. "The answer has to be no. Not because I want to punish him, I don't want that. Actually, I just want it to stop, but because a quiet settlement doesn't protect the next person he goes after. The record has to be public. That's the only thing that actually stops him." Nathan looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this a long time." "Since the morning I left Dunmore on a horse that was too tired to make it 3 miles. She looked at her hands. "I was so angry that morning. I was angry for weeks. And then at some point on that mountain, I stopped being angry and started being clear about what actually needed to happen." She paused. "You did that. I didn't do anything. You gave me somewhere quiet enough to think," she said. "That's not nothing. That's actually everything." He looked at her with that expression, the one she had cataloged from the first week, the one that started in his eyes and meant something was being felt that he was not yet saying. He said, "I know," she said, quietly. "I haven't." He stopped. "I'm not good at this." "At what?" "Saying things. Kind of things that." He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "Emma used to say I express things sideways. That I'd fix something, or build something, or show up somewhere instead of saying the actual words." "I noticed," Clara said. "I fixed your knee wrapping. And the fence post. And I showed you the trap lines." He paused. "And I came to Dunmore." "Yes," she said. "Nan, so he looked at her with the particular steadiness that she had come to understand was the most intimate thing about him, not touch, not words, but that complete, unhurried, undefended attention. I reckon you know what I'm saying, even though I'm not saying it right. I do, Clara said, and for what it's worth, I'm not good at it either. I express things through reorganizing supply shelves and fixing things that don't need fixing and asking questions until I understand a person better than they expected to be understood. I noticed, he said, with the almost smile, so I reckon we're even, she said. That was that. Not a declaration dressed up in borrowed language. Not a performance of feeling. Just two people sitting in a dry goods store in a town that has tried to destroy one of them, saying the plainest possible version of the truest possible thing, and both of them understanding it completely. Ruth, behind her counter, was very busy examining a bolt of fabric that required no examination whatsoever. A charge arrived on the third day. His name was Brixton, a federal marshal out of the territorial office, lean and methodical, with the look of a man who had seen complicated situations and preferred to let documentation do the talking. He arrived with the deputy 2 horses and a leather satchel full of papers, Patterson, that he read on the ride-in and had clearly already read several times before that. He met with Clara first, then with Nathan, then with each of the 6 people who had signed statements. And with Tom Lester for the longest time. He met with Ruth Adler, who gave him coffee and answered his questions with the precise documented recall of a woman who had been keeping mental records for 2 years in preparation for exactly this kind of meeting. He did not meet with Gerald Marsh until the second day. That meeting happened in the hotel, across from Ruth's store, and Clara was not in the room, which was the correct thing. This was Brixton's proceeding, not hers, and she had enough respect for the process to let it work. She was in Ruth's store when it happened, mending something. She was always mending something, and Nathan was at the counter talking to Ruth about something inconsequential. And the normalcy of the afternoon felt almost surreal against the weight of what was happening across the street. Ruth asked her. I'm worried, Clara said. I'm just not performing it. Ruth laughed, which was the right response. Nathan looked at Clara. She looked back at him. Outside, in the hotel, the future was being negotiated by a federal marshal with a satchel full of documentation, and a of 6 people who had decided that silence was no longer something they were willing to offer. The meeting lasted 3 hours. Brixton came out of the hotel at 4 in the afternoon and crossed directly to Ruth's store, which told Clara what she needed to know before he opened his mouth. He came in, accepted the coffee Ruth offered, and sat down. Marsh has agreed to a full accounting, Brixton said. Under federal supervision, all 11 property claims will be reviewed. Any claim found to be fraudulently obtained, and I expect that most of them will be subject to restitution. He looked at Clara. The warrant is formally withdrawn. Foley is being referred to the Territorial Bar Association for review of his conduct. Creel has been suspended, pending an investigation of his office's role in the property filings. Room was quiet, and the school? Clara asked. The deed is being reversed. The schoolhouse reverts to public trust. He paused. Patterson asked me to tell you, specifically, that the transfer was the clearest example of fraudulent use of public office he's seen in 12 years of federal work. Wants it in the record as a named case. It should be, Clara said. It will be. Brixton looked at his coffee. Marsh will keep his house and the land he held legitimately before he started this. He'll lose everything he acquired through the methods we've documented. He'll lose the bank majority because 2 of the board members came forward this morning. Apparently Lester's signing opened something up. He looked at Clara. In a year he'll still be a man with property and standing in this town. But he'll be a smaller man, and everyone will know why. That's enough, Clara said. That's what I wanted. Brixton looked at her with the slight curiosity of a man who had expected more. Most people in your position would want more. Most people in my position want the pain to stop, she said. The pain stops when the record is clear and the damage is repaired. The rest is just appetite, and I don't have that appetite. She looked at him steadily. 11 families get their property back. The school is public again. And Creel answer for what they did. That's the thing that needed doing. Brixton nodded slowly. He looked at Nathan. You're Cole. You're the man who sent the telegraph from Jenkins's office. I am, Nathan said. Patterson asked me to thank you. Carver, the man Marsh sent to Denver, had been in contact with two witnesses who were prepared to testify that Patterson had a personal connection to Miss Whitmore. Your wire got there 6 hours before Carver made his move. Gave Patterson time to document that the witnesses had each received payments from a Dunmore account traceable to Marsh's land company. He paused. 6 hours later, this case doesn't exist. It falls apart in Denver and Marsh walks away clean. Nathan was quiet for a moment. 6 hours, Clara said. Hours, Brixton confirmed. She looked at Nathan. He met her eyes. Neither of them said anything. Because there was nothing to say that adequately covered what those 6 hours had meant. The telegraph sent in the dark, the rider paid for speed. The man who had not been to town in 10 years walking through Dunmore at night to a telegraph office because she had needed him to. I'll need signed formal statements from both of you before I leave, Brixton said, standing. Tomorrow morning is fine. Tonight get some sleep. He looked at Clara with something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. You did good work, Miss Whitmore. We did good work, she said. Brixton glanced at Nathan, then back at Clara. The almost smile became slightly more definite. Ma'am, he said, I reckon you did. Ruth Adler threw what she called a modest supper, and what was in fact the most people Clara had seen in one room, since leaving Dunmore Lester and his wife, the Caldwells, Margaret Holt, old Deaver with his best jacket on, Jenkins from the telegraph office, and a handful of others who had heard enough of what had happened to want to be in the room where the ending of it was being acknowledged. Clara sat at the long table and ate good food, and listened to the sound of people talking without the particular careful quality that a town under one man's pressure had. Dunmore was talking differently. She could hear it. The way a room sounds when a weight has been lifted is different from the way it sounds when the weight is still there, and this room sounded like the former. Nathan sat beside her. He had not said much during supper, which was characteristic of him, but he had eaten 2 plates of Ruth's cooking, which Ruth treated as a higher compliment than anything he might have said. Lester's wife, a woman named Helen who had kind eyes and the manner of someone who knew exactly what was happening and approved of it completely, leaned across the table at some point and said to Nathan, You'll stay in the valley then? Nathan looked at her. Ma'am, you've been on that mountain 10 years. I'm asking if you'll stay down. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. Clara looked back at him with the clear, direct attention that was her default, and she waited, because this was not her question to answer for him. This was a question that belonged entirely to Nathan Cole, who had come down from a mountain carrying grief and caution and a 10-year habit of keeping himself where nothing could reach him, and who was sitting at a table full of people eating good food and making the particular sound of a community that was still intact and might be becoming more so. I reckon I'll figure that out, he said. Helen smiled at Clara, who kept her expression neutral, which was not as easy as it looked. After supper, after the dishes, after the last of the guests had gone, and Ruth had declared herself finished with the evening and retired with the completeness of a woman who had done everything she set out to do that day. Clara and Nathan sat on the bench outside Ruth's store. The town was quiet. Not the careful quiet of Dunmore under Gerald Marsh's long influence, but the ordinarity of small place settling into nighttime. She asked if you'll stay in the valley, Clara said. She did. You didn't answer. I noticed you noticed that. He looked out at the street. Mountain is still my place. He paused. Emma and Lily are buried on the eastern slope. I'm not going to move far from that. I know, Clara said quietly. But the valley isn't where I'm afraid of it feeling anymore. He looked at his hands. I thought for a long time that staying on the mountain was about them. Staying close, and that coming down meant leaving them somehow. Does it? He said it with the simplicity of someone who has arrived at a truth through considerable distance. Lily is wherever she is, and me being on a mountain or in a valley doesn't change that. I think I knew that for a while, and he stopped. It was easier to stay up there. Easier than finding out what I still was. What are you? Clara asked, not cruelly, with the genuine curiosity she applied to everything that mattered. He was quiet for a long moment. Still a man who fixes things, he said. Still, someone who reads terrain and sets traps and drinks too much coffee in the morning. He looked at her. Someone who met a woman with a bad knee and a skinning knife and $17 and apparently decided she was worth coming back to the world for. Clara looked at him for a moment. The summer evening was warm around them, and Dunmore was quiet. And the thing that had been building since the mountain, since coffee and a fence post and 2 letters written side by side and a bluff about a federal investigation and 6 hours that had changed. Everything was here now. Present and real, and not requiring any more distance between itself and being named. I am not an easy woman, she said, I noticed. I reorganize things without asking. I ask questions until I understand them completely. I make decisions and execute them, and tell people what I've decided rather than consulting them. You also, Nathan said, make very good coffee, and you wrap a knee better than anyone I've met. And you stood in front of 3 armed men and bluffed them with a bureaucratic letter and a revolver, and you did it without your hands shaking. He paused. I reckon I can manage the reorganizing. Clara looked at the street for a moment. Then she turned to look at him, full on, the way she looked at things she was deciding about. Harker's Ridge still needs a teacher, she said. It does. That's 12 miles west of your mountain. I know where it is. 12 miles is a reasonable distance, she said. For a man who knows the terrain. It's nothing, Nathan said. On a good horse, it's nothing. She held his gaze. I'll go to Harker's Ridge. Then I'll know where to find you, he said. And that was the whole of it. Not a dramatic declaration in front of witnesses. Not borrowed language from borrowed stories. 2 people on a bench in a small Colorado town at the end of something that had been very hard, saying the simplest possible version of what was true. In the plain American English of people who had both learned the hard way that plain truth was worth more than beautiful uncertainty. Nathan reached over and put his hand over hers on the bench between them. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a while without speaking, while Dunmore settled into its new quiet around them. 1 year later, the Harker's Ridge schoolhouse had 17 students, which was 4 more than the previous year and 6 more than the year before that. The news had gotten around the way news about a good teacher always eventually gets around, through older siblings and telling younger ones and parents telling neighbors that the school in Harker's Ridge had a teacher worth having. Clara Whitmore had repainted the door herself in September. She'd built 2 new bookshelves over the winter, with help from the Harker's Ridge carpenter, and from a man who rode in from the eastern mountain every other weekend and was, by community agreement, the most competent shelf builder anyone in the valley had encountered. May Teller had written her a letter in the spring. 11 pages, closely written, full of mathematical observations that Clara had read 3 times and responded to with 12 pages of her own. May was doing fine. She was more than fine. Tom Lester had written too. Federal accounting was complete. 9 of the 11 families had received restitution. Caldwell had his north pasture back and had expanded his herd. The Holts had paid the doctor bills. Foley had been removed from the bench. Creel had resigned and left Dunmore for somewhere nobody had yet tracked him to, which suited everyone. Gerald Marsh was still in Dunmore, smaller as Brixton had promised. Still wealthy, but no longer the kind of wealth that ate other people's lives. The town had not forgiven him exactly, but it had moved past him, which was a more thorough consequence than forgiveness. Ruth Adler had been elected to the town council in November, which was the first time a woman had held that position in Dunmore's history, in which Ruth treated with the brisk practicality she upped to everything, including the fact that she was better at the job than anyone who had held it before her. On a Saturday in July, exactly 1 year after Clara had first ridden into Harker's Ridge on a recovered horse, with Patterson's letter in her saddlebag, and the signed statements of 6 Dunmore residents, and the memory of a mountain that had given her back herself. Nathan Cole rode down from the eastern slope in the early morning and tied his horse at the post outside the schoolhouse. Clara was inside, doing the Saturday accounting of the supply list. She heard his horse. She always heard his horse. She came out onto the small porch and looked at him in the morning light. He looked back at her. He'd gotten a haircut sometime in the spring that had not substantially changed anything about the way he looked. And he was wearing the same coat and the same hat and the same boots that had walked down a mountain toward her a year ago when she was lying beside a collapsed horse with a skinning knife and $17 and what she thought at the time might be the end of her story. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep. Thinking about something?" He dismounted, tied the horse, came up to the porch. He reached into his coat and produced a piece of paper, folded once, and held it out. And she took it. It was a deed. A small parcel of land adjacent to the mountain cabin's eastern boundary, a flat piece of land in the valley below, accessible from both the mountain and the Harker's Ridge Road, with a creek running the south edge of it. Read it twice. "It's good land," he said, "level. Good water. Enough room for a house and a garden and a couple of horses." He was looking at the deed rather than at her, which meant he was doing the thing she'd learned to recognize expressing something sideways. "I've been looking at it since March. Took me a while to get the title sorted." There was a boundary question. "You bought land," she said. "I did, in the valley, between the mountain and Harker's Ridge." He looked up at her. 12 miles is a reasonable distance for a man who knows the terrain. "I figured maybe 6 miles was better." Clara looked at the deed. She looked at the land description, the creek, the flat ground, the eastern aspect. She looked at the name on the title, Nathan Cole and Clara Whitmore. She went very still. "Nathan," she said. "I know that's presumptuous," he said, and the fact that his voice was steady when he said it cost him something she could hear. I know you didn't ask me to, and I know I should have said something before I did it, and if you want me to have it changed." "Talking," she said. He stopped. She looked at the deed for another moment. Then she looked at him, this man who expressed things by fixing them, who had fixed the Mets post and the knee mapping and the supply shelf and the trap lines, and who had apparently decided that the most direct way to say what he meant was to put both their names on a piece of land between the mountain and her. New school, and show up on a Saturday morning with it in his coat pocket. "You couldn't sleep because you were afraid I'd say no," she said. "Yes, ma'am. You've been carrying this in your pocket since when?" "Tuesday. Nathan Cole." Her voice had the quality it got when she was working very hard to keep it level and was not entirely succeeding. "You are the most indirect person I have ever met." "Oh, where," he said. "Is that a no?" She folded the deed carefully along its original crease. In both hands. "Where is this land?" she said. "Exactly. About halfway between here and the mountain. There's a stand of cottonwoods on the north side of the creek. The soil's good. I had Caldwell look at it. He said it'd grow a kitchen garden without much trouble." "A kitchen garden," she said, "and a porch. There's room for a porch on the south side." "Gets the afternoon light." She looked at him. He looked at her. "Gets the afternoon light," she said. "It does." She stepped down from the porch. She stood in front of him in the morning light of a July Saturday in Harker's Ridge, Colorado. 1 year after a horse had gone down on a mountain trail, and a woman had reached for a knife, and a man had walked down a slope toward her because he was not going to leave a woman with a bad knee and an empty canteen to figure out the Rockies by herself, and she looked up at Nathan Cole with all the clear, direct, unguarded attention she possessed. She held out the deed. He took it. "We'll need a good carpenter," she said. "Nay." Something happened on Nathan Cole's face that had been happening more frequently in the past year, the complete, undefended, genuine smile of a man who has come all the way back from grief and chosen, with full knowledge of everything it cost and everything it was worth, to be present in his own life again. "I know a good carpenter," he said. "Wonderful." She turned and went back up the porch step. "Come inside, I'll make coffee." He followed her. The door closed behind them. Outside, the summer morning was warm and ordinary, and entirely unconcerned with the enormity of small things, a deed with two names on it, a porch that would get the afternoon light, a school with 17 students and a teacher who had come through the worst kind of unfairness and not been made smaller by it, and a man who had spent 10 years on a mountain learning the patient, active kind of waiting, and had finally found what he'd been waiting for without knowing he was waiting for it. The cottonwoods by the creek on the 18th piece of land between the mountain and Harker's Ridge moved in the morning wind. Coffee, when Clara made it, was perfect. It always was. Nathan Cole, sitting at a table in a schoolhouse in a valley he had once left for a mountain he no longer needed to hide on, looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had reorganized his supply shelf and rewrapped his fenets post, and asked questions until she understood things completely and bluffed 3 armed men with a bureaucratic letter, and walked back into the town that had broken her and put it back together, and understood with the complete and grounded certainty of a man who had earned his understanding the hard way that this was not the end of something. This was what home felt like when you'd stopped running long enough to build one. And some people, the ones who have been broken by the world and refuse to stay broken, are the only ones capable of building it that strong.